Ancient Language of the Stars Translated. By Phil Rocco Williams. Audiobook version. Introduction. Reading Reality Through the Sky. Human attempts to understand reality began with attention, not belief. Before writing, formal measurement, or institutional knowledge, communities learned by watching what repeated. The sky offered the most consistent pattern field available to early observation. While terrain shifts, weather fluctuates, and human groups relocate, celestial motion remains stable enough to track and compare over long spans of time. This stability made the heavens a practical reference system. Seasonal changes correlate with solar position, day length, and star risings. Over many cycles, these correlations become reliable signals for behavior. Planting, harvesting, migration, and storage all improve when timed to recurring celestial cues. The sky does not persuade, it verifies through repetition. As observational knowledge grew, preservation became the constraint. Memory is limited, and complex timing relationships can be lost in a single generation. Cultures therefore developed compression methods that could store celestial structure in portable and durable forms. Symbolic imagery, numerical counts, geometric relationships, and spatial alignments emerged as functional encoding tools. The phrase ancient language of the stars describes this system of observation translated into stable representations. It is not a single inherited code delivered intact by any one culture. It is a convergent framework that appears wherever human groups study the same external patterns long enough to build shared models of time, order, and proportion. A reality scientist approach treats the language of the stars as pattern literacy. It asks what was observed, how it was encoded, why it was useful, and how it shaped collective behavior. This framing keeps the work accessible to beginners while remaining rigorous enough to support deeper synthesis, showing how celestial structure influenced cognition, culture, and the foundations of history. 1. The sky as humanity's first stable reference. For early human societies, the sky functioned as the only large-scale system that demonstrated continuity beyond human influence. Terrestrial environments were unstable by comparison. Rivers changed course, climates shifted, animals migrated, and vegetation cycles fluctuated. Against this variability, the visible motions of the sun, moon, and stars remained reliably patterned across generations. This stability mattered because it was invariant to human action. Fire, tools, and movement could alter land, but no behavior changed where the sun rose or when certain stars returned. The sky therefore operated as an external reference system immune to manipulation, error, or social pressure, establishing trust through consistency alone. The sky was also universally accessible. Entire groups observed the same dawns, lunar phases, and seasonal stellar appearances. Verification required no authority, only patience. Disagreement could be resolved by continued observation, making the sky humanity's first shared validation framework grounded in direct perception. Spatial orientation emerged naturally from this relationship. Solar motion fixed east and west, while persistent stellar points stabilized north-south awareness. Direction became relational to the sky rather than dependent on local landmarks, enabling orientation across unfamiliar or changing terrain. By anchoring perception to a stable celestial framework, early humans externalized both memory and orientation. This reduced cognitive uncertainty and allowed planning beyond immediate experience. Seasonal preparation, migration timing, and coordinated activity all depended on this reference. The sky became a permanent scaffold for thought, enabling knowledge to persist beyond individual lifespans. The language of the stars begins here as an operational coordinate system, where reality is structured through observation of an external order that remains consistent even as everything else changes. 2. Pattern recognition before symbolism. Pattern recognition is a biological capacity that predates language, abstraction, and formal reasoning. Long before humans developed words, numbers, or myths, survival depended on the ability to detect repetition, variation, and anomaly within the environment. This capability evolved under direct pressure, where recognizing regularity allowed anticipation of change before it produced risk or opportunity. The sky provided the most stable and extensive training field for this capacity. Celestial phenomena unfolded slowly, demanding attention across days, months, and years. The shifting position of sunrise along the horizon, the repeating phases of the moon, and the periodic reappearance of specific stars required memory and comparison rather than immediate reaction. Recognition depended on continuity of observation rather than interpretation. At this stage, symbolism was unnecessary and absent. Humans did not require names, stories, or explanations to benefit from pattern detection. Recognizing recurrence alone enabled practical outcomes such as anticipating seasonal transitions, aligning movement with environmental change, and coordinating group behavior. Utility emerged directly from correlation, not from meaning-making. Knowledge transmission relied on shared observation rather than verbal instruction. Elders demonstrated by pointing, waiting, and repeating observations across time. Learning occurred through direct experience, allowing patterns to be verified independently by each observer. This minimized distortion caused by language compression or personal interpretation. This pre-symbolic pattern literacy formed the cognitive foundation for all later representational systems. Geometry, number, calendars, and mythology did not generate understanding but condensed it into portable forms. These systems functioned as memory compression layers layered atop trained perception. The language of the stars originates here, as disciplined seeing where structure is recognized before it is named, ensuring that abstraction remains grounded in observable reality rather than drifting into narrative invention. 3. Cycles, recurrence, and predictability. Cycles are defined by return rather than by measured duration. Early humans did not experience time as quantified units but as sequences that repeated with recognizable regularity. The sky provided the clearest and most consistent demonstration of recurrence, where specific configurations disappeared and reappeared in reliable order, allowing expectation to form through repetition alone. The daily motion of the sun established the most immediate and unavoidable cycle, structuring activity, rest, and exposure to light. Beyond this, the moon introduced a slower, clearly segmented rhythm through its changing phases, visible to all observers without tools. Stellar patterns extended recurrence further, marking seasonal transitions and long-term environmental shifts that unfolded across months and years. These cycles operated simultaneously at different scales, reinforcing one another through layered repetition. Predictability emerged from correlation rather than explanation. When similar sky patterns repeatedly coincided with similar conditions on land, confidence in anticipation increased. Humans did not need to understand why cycles occurred to use them effectively. Reliability alone allowed planning of movement, preparation of resources, and coordination of group behavior. Redundancy strengthened this predictive system. If clouds obscured one signal, others remained available. Solar position, lunar phase, and stellar arrangement could compensate for one another, reducing error introduced by short-term disruption. This overlap trained attention toward convergence of patterns rather than reliance on a single indicator. Through sustained exposure to cyclical recurrence, human cognition adapted to expect structured return instead of randomness. Time became intelligible as patterned sequence rather than continuous uncertainty. This expectation reshaped memory and planning, enabling action ahead of events rather than reaction after them. The language of the stars encodes predictability itself, embedding the principle of return into perception and transforming the sky into a dependable framework for anticipating reality across multiple temporal horizons. 4. Observation as survival intelligence. Observation functioned as a primary form of survival intelligence long before it was associated with curiosity, philosophy, or science. For early humans, accurate perception directly affected outcomes related to food acquisition, migration timing, shelter preparation, and exposure to environmental risk. Misreading patterns or ignoring change carried immediate consequences, reinforcing attentiveness as an adaptive necessity rather than a passive trait. The sky demanded a mode of observation distinct from immediate threat detection. Celestial patterns unfolded slowly and consistently, requiring patience, memory, and comparison across extended periods. Unlike predators or storms, the sky did not reward rapid reaction. Instead, it trained the ability to track gradual change and maintain continuity of attention across days, seasons, and years. This observational skill produced advantage primarily at the group level. No single individual could maintain complete long-term records of celestial behavior, but shared observation allowed communities to pool memory and verify patterns collectively. Survival intelligence became distributed, relying on repeated confirmation rather than personal interpretation or authority. The sky also enforced correction without negotiation. Predictions based on observation either aligned with reality or failed visibly. Missed seasonal shifts, mistimed movement, or inaccurate expectation produced consequences that exposed perceptual error. This feedback loop refined attention, steadily reducing projection and reinforcing reliance on repeatable pattern rather than assumption. Over time, this discipline reshaped cognition itself. Humans learned to separate immediate appearance from long-term behavior, signal from noise, and coincidence from recurrence. Observation became structured, cumulative, and corrective. This capacity transferred beyond the sky into navigation, planning, and coordination of social activity. The language of the stars originates here as a training system for disciplined perception, where survival intelligence emerges from sustained attention aligned with external structure, allowing human behavior to synchronize with reality rather than react blindly to momentary conditions. 5. Time before clocks. Before time was divided into units, it was understood as ordered experience. Early humans did not perceive time as a quantity to be measured but as a sequence of recurring conditions that could be recognized and anticipated. Time existed as relational awareness, where one state reliably followed another, allowing orientation within change without numerical abstraction. The sky provided the most dependable structure for this ordering. Day and night created the most immediate temporal boundary, regulating activity, rest, and exposure to risk. The moon introduced a slower and visibly segmented cycle that expanded temporal awareness beyond the daily rhythm. Stellar patterns extended this structure further, marking seasonal transitions and long-term environmental shifts that unfolded predictably across the year. Timekeeping in this context relied on recognition rather than counting. Knowing that a particular sky configuration preceded migration, temperature change, or resource availability was sufficient. Memory encoded sequence and position rather than duration. What mattered was not how long something lasted, but where it occurred within a repeating pattern. This qualitative understanding of time supported planning without calculation. Preparation was triggered by observation rather than schedules. Actions aligned with expected recurrence instead of fixed intervals, keeping human behavior synchronized with environmental rhythms rather than abstract timetables imposed from outside observation. By grounding time in visible recurrence, early humans externalized temporal structure into the environment itself. The sky functioned as a continuously readable calendar rather than a tool consulted intermittently. This reduced cognitive load, stabilized collective memory, and allowed coordination across generations without written records. Time became a property of relationship rather than measurement, embedded directly in observable cycles. The language of the stars framed temporal awareness as participation in patterned return, enabling humans to operate within long horizons of change while remaining anchored to the immediate, visible structure of the world that generated those cycles. 6. Spatial awareness and horizon literacy. Spatial awareness expanded significantly when humans learned to read the horizon as a stable interface between sky and land. Unlike terrain, which could vary dramatically over short distances, the horizon provided a consistent frame where celestial motion intersected with the Earth. This interface allowed space to be understood relationally rather than locally. The rising and setting points of the sun established repeatable spatial anchors. Observers noticed that these points shifted gradually along the horizon across the year, returning to familiar extremes in predictable cycles. This trained spatial memory beyond immediate surroundings, linking position to time through celestial movement rather than static landmarks. Stars extended this literacy further. Certain stars rose and set at fixed points, while others circled without setting, creating stable directional references. These patterns enabled orientation at night and across unfamiliar territory. Space became structured through reference to the sky, not dependent on visible features that could disappear, change, or mislead. Horizon literacy also supported movement planning. By tracking where celestial bodies interacted with the horizon, humans could maintain direction over long distances. This was essential for migration, trade, and coordinated travel, particularly in environments where landmarks were sparse or repetitive. By integrating spatial awareness with celestial observation, humans unified space and time into a single perceptual framework. Direction was no longer static but dynamic, shifting predictably with cycles. The horizon became a measuring surface where motion, orientation, and recurrence intersected. The language of the stars encoded space as a living system, where location was understood through ongoing relationship to celestial movement, allowing humans to navigate expansively while remaining grounded in a consistent external structure that transcended local variability. 7. Light as information. Light functioned as information long before it was understood as a physical phenomenon. For early humans, variations in brightness, duration, angle, and color conveyed actionable data about time, season, and environmental state. The sky was the most reliable source of this information, delivering continuous signals without requiring interpretation or belief. The sun's light changed predictably across the year. Day length increased and decreased in regular patterns, signaling seasonal transition with high reliability. The angle of sunlight altered shadows, warmth, and visibility, providing additional cues about time progression without the need for tools or markers. These changes were gradual but consistent, rewarding sustained attention. Lunar light added a secondary informational layer. The moon's phases affected nighttime visibility, influencing movement, hunting, and safety. Its brightness and position interacted with stellar visibility, allowing observers to infer timing and sequence even in the absence of daylight. Light became a comparative signal rather than a binary condition. Atmospheric effects further enriched this informational field. Clarity, diffusion, and coloration of light reflected weather patterns and seasonal shifts. Observation trained sensitivity to subtle variation rather than dramatic change, strengthening discrimination between transient noise and stable signal. By attending to light as structured variation, humans learned to extract meaning directly from perception. Light was not symbolic but functional, encoding temporal and environmental relationships through its behavior. This trained the mind to treat sensory input as data rather than stimulus alone. The language of the stars operates through light as its primary carrier, where information is embedded in change over time. This relationship established a perceptual discipline that later supported measurement, geometry, and scientific observation by grounding understanding in consistent, observable variation rather than abstract explanation. 8. Motion as measurement. Before instruments existed, motion itself served as the primary means of measurement. Early humans did not quantify change using units but compared positions across time. The sky provided the most consistent and observable motions available, allowing change to be tracked through displacement rather than numbers. The sun's movement across the sky established a visible progression that could be followed daily. Its rising point, arc height, and setting location changed slowly and predictably across the year. These shifts allowed observers to measure time indirectly by comparing position rather than counting intervals. Motion became the metric. The moon introduced a different scale of motion. Its nightly position against the stars, combined with its changing phase, provided a layered indicator of progression. Relative movement mattered more than speed. What counted was not how fast something moved, but how its position compared to prior observation. Stellar motion extended this principle further. While most stars appeared fixed relative to one another, their collective shift across seasons revealed long-term movement detectable only through generational comparison. This trained awareness of slow change beyond individual lifespans, reinforcing measurement through memory rather than immediacy. By using motion as a comparative reference, humans transformed observation into quantification without numbers. Measurement emerged as relational assessment. Before versus after, here versus there, then versus now. This approach embedded scale directly into perception, allowing accuracy without abstraction. The language of the stars encodes motion as its measuring system, where change itself becomes the unit. This trained the human mind to evaluate reality through relative displacement across time, a foundational skill later formalized in geometry, astronomy, and physics, but originally rooted in direct comparison of observable movement within a stable celestial framework. 9. From watching to recording. Observation alone was insufficient once human awareness extended beyond individual lifespan and memory capacity. As celestial patterns revealed longer cycles, the need arose to preserve knowledge across generations without relying solely on oral continuity. Recording emerged as a functional response to temporal scale, not as an abstract invention. Early recording did not begin with writing. It began with physical reference. Marks, alignments, placements, and constructions that encoded observation into the environment itself. Stones were positioned, lines were carved, and structures were oriented to preserve relationships that could be reread through repeated observation of the sky. These records did not describe patterns, they embodied them. This form of recording externalized memory. Instead of relying on recall, observers could verify alignment by watching celestial events interact with physical markers. Accuracy was maintained through correspondence between sky motion and material reference, reducing distortion introduced by storytelling or interpretation. Redundancy was essential. Multiple markers encoded the same relationship to ensure survival of information if one was damaged or forgotten. Recording was designed for persistence rather than efficiency, favoring durability over elegance. Knowledge survived through overlap rather than precision alone. By embedding observation into physical space, humans extended pattern literacy beyond the limits of individual cognition. Recording transformed watching into continuity, allowing the sky's long cycles to be tracked across centuries. This shift did not replace observation, it reinforced it. The language of the stars evolved from transient perception into durable reference, where knowledge was preserved not as explanation but as alignment. Reality itself became the archive, enabling each generation to verify patterns directly and maintain coherence with the same external structures that shaped their predecessors' understanding. 10. The language of the stars is a reality sub-language. The language of the stars is not metaphorical, symbolic, or narrative in its origin. It functions as a reality sub-language composed of observable relationships between motion, position, light, and recurrence. Unlike spoken language, which relies on agreement and convention, this system operates independently of culture, belief, or interpretation. This sub-language emerged through direct engagement with consistent external structure. Its basic elements are not words but cycles, alignments, proportions, and returns. Meaning is derived from correspondence between celestial behavior and terrestrial consequence. Understanding does not require translation, only accurate observation and memory. Because it is grounded in repeatability, the language of the stars is self-correcting. Incorrect readings fail operationally. A misjudged cycle leads to mistimed action, while a correct reading produces predictable results. Validation occurs through outcome rather than authority, reinforcing objectivity. This system operates beneath later symbolic layers. Calendars, geometry, architecture, and myth all draw from it, but they do not define it. They compress and transmit what was first learned directly from the sky. The sub-language remains readable even when these overlays are removed or distorted. As a reality sub-language, the stellar system structures perception itself. It teaches the observer to think relationally, to measure through comparison, and to trust patterns that persist beyond individual experience. It aligns human cognition with large-scale order without requiring explanation or belief. By grounding understanding in external consistency, it stabilizes memory, planning, and coordination across generations. The language of the stars therefore functions as an underlying grammar of reality, one that shaped early human intelligence and continues to operate wherever observation replaces assumption and pattern replaces narrative as the basis for understanding the world. Part 2. Encoding the sky into thought. 11. Memory, pattern, and early cognition. Early human cognition developed under conditions where memory and pattern recognition were inseparable. Survival required not only noticing events but retaining their order, spacing, and recurrence over time. Memory was not abstract storage but an active process of linking present perception to prior observation, allowing patterns to be recognized as continuous rather than isolated. The sky placed specific demands on memory. Celestial patterns unfolded too slowly to be grasped in a single viewing. Recognizing a cycle required recalling earlier positions, comparing them to current states, and holding expectations about future return. This trained memory is a comparative system rather than a static archive. Pattern recognition and memory reinforced each other. The more consistently a pattern recurred, the easier it was to remember, and the better it was remembered, the more precisely recurrence could be detected. Cognition adapted to favor long-term relational tracking over short-term detail, shaping how information was prioritized and retained. This process operated collectively as well as individually. Shared observation allowed memory to be distributed across a group, stabilizing knowledge beyond a single lifespan. Agreement about what had been seen before strengthened confidence in what was expected to return, reducing reliance on individual recall alone. Through repeated engagement with celestial recurrence, early cognition became structured around pattern continuity. Memory evolved to track relationships across time rather than isolated events. This shift allowed humans to think beyond immediacy, forming mental models that linked past, present, and anticipated future into a single coherent framework. Encoding the sky into thought transformed memory into a predictive tool, where cognition itself became aligned with external cycles, enabling understanding to extend beyond direct experience while remaining grounded in observable, repeatable structure. 12. Geometry before mathematics. Geometry emerged from observation long before it was formalized as mathematics. Early humans encountered shape, angle, proportion, and alignment directly through interaction with the environment and the sky. These relationships were perceived visually and spatially, not calculated. Geometry began as recognition of form and relation, not as symbolic abstraction. The sky provided the most consistent source of geometric experience. The circular path of the sun, the arc it traced across the sky, the repeating curve of the moon's phases, and the fixed angular relationships between stars trained the eye to recognize shape as structure. These forms were not idealized, they were observed repeatedly in motion and position. This geometric awareness was practical. Angles defined direction, arcs defined seasonal height and duration, circles defined recurrence and completion. Straight lines emerged through sightlines connecting horizon points, stars, and rising positions. Geometry was learned through use, embedded in orientation, movement, and planning. Importantly, this geometric understanding did not rely on numbers. No counting was required to recognize symmetry, alignment, or proportional change. Relationships were comparative rather than quantitative. One position was higher than another. One interval was longer or shorter. Geometry functioned as spatial logic without arithmetic. This perceptual geometry formed the substrate upon which mathematics was later built. When numbers eventually appeared, they did not create structure, they labeled it. Mathematics compressed geometric relationships into symbolic form, enabling transmission and calculation, but the underlying understanding remained visual and spatial. Encoding the sky into thought required geometry first, because cognition had to recognize form and relation before it could abstract them. The language of the stars therefore entered the human mind as geometry in motion, training perception to detect structure directly in space and time, long before it was reduced to symbols on a surface. 13. Ratio as meaning. Ratio emerged as a cognitive tool when humans began to recognize that relationships between quantities mattered more than absolute values. Before numbers were formalized, proportional comparison allowed observers to detect consistency across variation. The sky provided repeated exposure to this principle, where relative relationships remained stable even as conditions changed. Celestial observation revealed ratio through comparison of intervals and positions. The length of daylight relative to night shifted predictably across seasons. The apparent height of the sun at noon varied in proportion to seasonal change. Lunar phases divided the month into repeatable segments, not by count, but by visible fractional progression. Meaning arose from relative difference rather than precise measurement. These proportional relationships were operational. Knowing that one interval was twice as long as another, or that one position marked an extreme relative to others, was sufficient for planning and anticipation. Ratio allowed consistency to be detected across environments, climates, and years without requiring standardized units. Ratio also stabilized memory. Absolute values are fragile, but proportional relationships persist even when conditions fluctuate. A harvest aligned to a midpoint between two solar extremes remains valid despite yearly variation. Ratio allowed knowledge to remain portable across time and circumstance, preserving function when precision was unavailable. By encoding meaning through proportion, early cognition learned to prioritize relationship over magnitude. This shift allowed humans to extract structure from complexity and continuity from change. Ratio became a bridge between geometry and number, enabling abstraction without losing reference to observation. The language of the stars uses ratio as a core semantic unit, where meaning is carried by how things relate rather than what they are individually. This trained the human mind to interpret reality through proportional structure, a capacity that later underpinned mathematics, music, architecture, and scientific modeling while remaining rooted in direct perception of the sky. 14. The birth of sacred geometry. Sacred geometry did not originate as a spiritual doctrine or symbolic system. It emerged from repeated observation of consistent geometric relationships in nature and the sky. The term, sacred, was applied later, after these forms proved reliable, durable, and foundational to survival, orientation, and memory. Geometry became sacred because it worked, not because it was imagined to be mystical. Celestial observation revealed forms that repeated regardless of location or culture. Circles defined cycles such as the sun's apparent path and the moon's phases. Lines emerged through sightlines connecting horizon points, rising stars, and seasonal extremes. Intersections marked moments of transition and balance. These forms were encountered directly, not invented. As these relationships proved dependable, they were preserved and emphasized. Alignments were repeated in structures, paths, and meeting places. Shapes that consistently encoded timing, direction, or proportion were favored because they reduced error and extended memory. Geometry became a tool for stabilizing knowledge across generations. Over time, these reliable forms acquired cultural significance. Because they governed food cycles, movement, and coordination, they were treated with care and respect. The reverence attached to them reflected dependence rather than belief. Geometry was protected because it encoded survival-critical information. The birth of sacred geometry marks the point where repeated observational success transformed geometry into a trusted cognitive framework. Shapes were no longer just seen, they were relied upon as carriers of order. This transition elevated geometry from perception to principle, embedding it into architecture, ritual space, and social organization. Sacred geometry represents the formalization of observed structure into durable form, where reliability conferred authority. The language of the stars entered human culture here as preserved geometry, ensuring that the relationships first seen in the sky could continue to guide behavior, planning, and coordination long after the original observers were gone. 15. Fibonacci and natural growth patterns. Natural growth patterns revealed that structure could emerge from simple repetition governed by proportional constraint. Long before formal sequences were defined, early observers noticed that certain forms expanded in consistent ratios rather than random increments. Plants, shells, and branching systems exhibited predictable scaling that mirrored patterns also visible in celestial motion. The sky reinforced this observation through gradual expansion and contraction rather than abrupt change. The increasing and decreasing arc of the sun across seasons, the waxing and waning of lunar illumination, and the slow outward progression of stellar positions relative to the horizon reflected growth and recession governed by proportional continuity. Change occurred through accumulation, not jump. These patterns demonstrated that growth favored balance between expansion and stability. Too rapid an increase disrupted structure, while too little stalled development. Natural systems optimized continuity by adding new form in proportion to what already existed. This principle became intuitively understood through repeated exposure rather than calculation. Early cognition internalized this logic. Humans learned to expect that new structure would emerge from existing structure rather than replace it. This expectation supported planning, construction, and memory. Growth was perceived as layered continuity, where each stage preserved relationship to the previous one. What would later be formalized as the Fibonacci sequence reflects this deeper perceptual insight. It encodes growth as relational accumulation, where each step derives meaning from its predecessors. The significance of this pattern lies not in numerical identity but in structural behavior. It appears wherever systems must grow while maintaining coherence. The language of the stars incorporates this principle by revealing that both terrestrial and celestial systems favor proportional expansion. By encoding growth through relationship rather than magnitude, early humans learned to recognize continuity across scale, allowing cognition to link biological growth, environmental cycles, and celestial motion into a unified understanding of how structure persists through change. 16. Symmetry, asymmetry, and balance. Symmetry emerged as an observable condition long before it became an aesthetic or symbolic concept. Early humans encountered symmetry directly in repeated celestial and terrestrial patterns where opposing elements mirrored one another in position or motion. The sky provided clear examples, such as the balanced arc of the sun across the horizon and the apparent regularity of star groupings that maintained consistent internal relationships over time. However, Observation also revealed that perfect symmetry was rare. Seasonal change disrupted balance, solar paths shifted, and lunar phases introduced uneven illumination. These asymmetries were not errors but essential features of dynamic systems. The sky taught that balance was not static equality but regulated variation around a stable center. Symmetry described reference, while asymmetry described motion. This distinction had practical consequences. Perfect symmetry indicated stability, but asymmetry signaled transition. Shifts in sunrise position marked seasonal change. Unequal day and night lengths indicated movement toward or away from equilibrium. Balance was therefore read through deviation rather than stillness, requiring attention to difference rather than sameness. Early cognition adapted to this logic. Humans learned to recognize that systems remain functional through controlled imbalance. Too much symmetry indicated stagnation, while excessive asymmetry indicated instability. Balance emerged as a relational condition maintained through ongoing adjustment rather than fixed form. By encoding symmetry and asymmetry as complementary rather than opposing principles, early observers developed a nuanced understanding of equilibrium. Balance was understood as a dynamic process visible in celestial motion, environmental cycles, and later in construction and organization. This insight allowed humans to design structures, schedules, and systems that tolerated variation without collapse. The language of the stars encodes balance not as perfection but as regulated change, teaching cognition to expect movement around stability rather than immobility. This framework became foundational for later developments in geometry, architecture, mechanics, and systems thinking, all rooted in the observed behavior of the sky as a balanced but never static system. 17. Symbol as compression. Symbols emerged as a response to cognitive load rather than as expressions of belief or creativity. As observational knowledge expanded, the volume of detail exceeded what could be retained through direct memory alone. Symbols functioned as compression devices, condensing complex relationships into simplified forms that could be recalled, transmitted, and reconstructed through reference rather than repetition. The sky provided the pressure that made compression necessary. Celestial patterns operated across multiple timescales simultaneously, combining daily motion, lunar cycles, and long-term stellar shifts. Holding all of these relationships in active memory was impractical. Compression allowed observers to preserve structure without retaining every observation explicitly. Early symbols did not represent objects, they represented relationships. A mark might encode a recurring interval, an alignment, or a directional extreme. Meaning was not contained in the symbol itself but in the observer's ability to decompress it back into lived pattern through reference to the sky. Symbol and observation remained linked. This compression preserved accuracy when transmission occurred. Instead of retelling every observation verbally, symbols allowed knowledge to be carried across distance and time with reduced distortion. The observer did not inherit a story but a trigger for reconstruction, ensuring that meaning remained anchored to verification rather than belief. Symbolic compression transformed cognition by allowing layered knowledge to persist without overwhelming memory. It enabled cumulative understanding, where new observations could be added without erasing old ones. The language of the stars relies on this mechanism, using symbols as access points rather than substitutes for reality. Properly used, symbols reduce complexity without severing connection to observation. This distinction is critical. When symbols remain tied to verification, they preserve pattern literacy. When detached, they become narratives. The early development of symbolic compression maintained alignment with the sky, ensuring that abstraction served memory and coordination while remaining subordinate to observable structure. 18. The limits of oral transmission. Oral transmission was the earliest method for preserving and sharing observational knowledge, but it carried inherent limitations once information extended beyond short cycles and immediate experience. Spoken memory is vulnerable to drift, omission, and reinterpretation, especially when patterns unfold across timescales longer than a single human lifespan. The sky exposed these limits clearly. Celestial cycles often exceeded generational memory. Long stellar shifts, precessional effects, and rare alignments could not be reliably preserved through storytelling alone. Each retelling introduced compression, simplification, or emphasis shaped by the speaker's experience. Over time, structure risked being replaced by narrative coherence rather than observational accuracy. Oral systems also depended heavily on authority. Knowledge survived only if elders were trusted and listened to, and if transmission remained uninterrupted. Disruption through migration, conflict, or population loss could erase entire observational lineages. The sky itself remained stable, but access to accumulated interpretation did not. Another limitation lay in ambiguity. Spoken descriptions struggle to preserve precise spatial and temporal relationships. Directions, angles, and proportions are difficult to convey without reference. Listeners often reconstructed patterns differently, leading to divergence even when intent was accurate. These constraints drove the need for external reference beyond speech. Physical markers, alignments, and later symbols emerged to stabilize meaning where language failed. Oral transmission remained valuable for contextual framing and instruction, but it could no longer carry the full burden of long-cycle knowledge alone. The language of the stars demanded durability, precision, and verification that speech could not guarantee by itself. Recognizing the limits of oral transmission was not a failure of memory but an adaptive insight. It marked the transition from knowledge held solely in minds to knowledge anchored in space, form, and repeatable reference, ensuring that celestial understanding could survive interruption, variation, and time without dissolving into story. 19. From observation to mental models. Observation alone does not produce understanding unless it is organized into internal structure. As humans accumulated repeated experiences of celestial patterns, the mind began to assemble these observations into coherent internal representations. Mental models emerged as simplified but structured maps that linked past observation, present perception, and anticipated future states. The sky provided ideal conditions for this transition. Its patterns were consistent enough to support internal prediction yet complex enough to require abstraction. Observers no longer needed to watch continuously once relationships were learned. A remembered configuration could stand in for direct observation, allowing the mind to simulate future positions and outcomes. These early mental models were relational rather than descriptive. They did not attempt to explain causes but encoded sequence, position, and proportion. A model might represent when a star would return relative to the sun's position, or how day length related to seasonal change. Accuracy depended on correspondence with observation, not on narrative coherence. Mental models improved efficiency. Instead of relearning patterns through repeated exposure, individuals could anticipate change internally and verify it externally. This reduced cognitive load while increasing predictive capacity. When models failed, correction occurred through renewed observation, maintaining alignment between thought and reality. The shift from observation to mental modeling marked a major cognitive advance. Humans began to carry the sky within the mind, not as imagery but as structured expectation. This enabled planning beyond immediate sensory input and allowed coordination of action across time. Importantly, these models remained provisional, continuously updated through verification. The language of the stars shaped cognition by training the mind to build internal structures that mirrored external order. Understanding became the ability to model reality accurately, not to explain it verbally. This capacity later expanded into mathematics, science, and engineering, but its origin lay in the disciplined construction of mental models grounded in repeated, shared observation of the sky. 20. Cognitive compression and predictive representation. As observational scope expanded, human cognition required a method to preserve pattern continuity without constant sensory input. The sky provided reliable structure, but its slow cycles demanded internal retention between observations. Cognitive compression emerged as the solution, allowing recurring relationships to be stored as simplified representations rather than continuous records of experience. This compression did not reduce accuracy when properly constrained. Instead of memorizing positions or events, the mind retained relational rules: sequence, proportional change, directional movement, and periodic return. These compressed representations enabled prediction by simulating expected outcomes based on prior correspondence. The sky effectively trained cognition to think in terms of structure rather than snapshot. Predictive representation transformed observation into foresight. Anticipation became possible because internal models could be projected forward in time. This allowed coordination of action before change fully manifested. Planting, movement, construction, and preparation depended on this capacity to act ahead of visible consequence while remaining grounded in observed regularity. However, Predictive representation introduced to critical vulnerability. Once models existed internally, they could persist beyond their accuracy. If not regularly tested against external reference, compressed representations drifted. Early systems countered this risk through enforced recalibration. Shared observation, seasonal markers, and collective timing exposed error and prevented internal models from becoming self-validating. Cognitive compression and predictive representation marked the point where pattern literacy became scalable. Knowledge no longer depended solely on presence, but on disciplined internal simulation anchored to verification. This section advances the Part 2 framework by showing how the language of the stars moved beyond memory into functional prediction. It establishes the mechanism by which external pattern was transformed into usable foresight without detaching from reality, completing the transition from observation to structured internal representation that could support increasingly complex human systems. Part 3. Encoding the Sky into Human Systems. 21. Calendars as operational translations. Calendars emerged as practical tools for coordinating action rather than abstract representations of time. They functioned as operational translations of observed celestial cycles into repeatable human schedules. The need for calendars arose when communities required synchronized behavior across agriculture, movement, ritual, and resource management. The sky provided the raw structure for this translation. Solar cycles established the broad framework of the year, while lunar cycles offered finer segmentation within it. Stellar appearances anchored seasonal markers that remained consistent even when weather or local conditions varied. Calendars did not invent time, they mapped observed recurrence into usable reference. Early calendars were not numerical grids but relational systems. Events were positioned relative to celestial markers rather than fixed dates. A planting period might be defined by the sun's height or a star's first appearance at dawn. This preserved flexibility while maintaining alignment with environmental reality. Calendars also reduced cognitive load. Instead of requiring continuous observation, they allowed communities to rely on stabilized reference points. This made coordination possible across larger groups and longer timescales. Errors in calendars produced visible consequences, enforcing correction through outcome rather than authority. As operational systems, calendars translated celestial behavior into human timing without severing verification. They remained readable against the sky itself. This ensured that schedules stayed adaptive rather than rigid. The language of the stars entered social organization here as structured timekeeping, where collective behavior was synchronized to external cycles rather than imposed abstraction. Calendars encoded reliability into daily life, allowing human systems to operate coherently across seasons and generations while remaining anchored to the same observable patterns that first trained perception. 22. Ritual as collective time enforcement. Ritual emerged as a mechanism for enforcing temporal alignment at the collective level. While calendars translated celestial cycles into reference systems, rituals ensured that those references were acted upon consistently. Ritual was not symbolic performance in its origin but a behavioral technology for synchronizing groups to shared timing derived from observation. Celestial cycles provided the schedule, but human systems required reinforcement to maintain coordination. Seasonal transitions, planting windows, migrations, and resource preparation demanded group participation. Ritualized actions anchored these moments in collective behavior, reducing variance caused by individual perception or memory lapse. Ritual functioned as embodied timekeeping. Repeated actions performed at specific celestial markers encoded timing into the body rather than relying solely on cognition. Movement, posture, sound, and repetition reinforced temporal awareness through physical participation. This reduced abstraction and increased reliability across varying levels of individual understanding. Because rituals were public, they created mutual accountability. Deviations were visible, not theoretical. Participation reinforced alignment, while absence or mistiming exposed error. This visibility stabilized timing across generations even as individual observers changed. Ritual preserved sequence when direct observation weakened. As collective time enforcement, ritual translated celestial regularity into social rhythm. Its power did not derive from belief but from repetition tied to external cycles. When aligned correctly, ritual maintained coherence between sky-based timing and human action. The language of the stars entered social systems here as coordinated behavior rather than narrative meaning. Ritual ensured that celestial knowledge was not merely known but enacted, embedding time into shared practice. This allowed human systems to scale, persist, and remain synchronized with environmental cycles long after the original observers were gone, without requiring continuous explanation or centralized authority. 23. Sacred space as embedded measurement. Sacred space originated as a functional solution to the problem of preserving measurement across time without reliance on continuous observation. As celestial knowledge accumulated, communities required stable reference environments where spatial relationships encoded timing, direction, and proportion directly into the landscape. Sacred space emerged as measurement made permanent. The sky provided the template, but land provided persistence. By fixing sightlines, alignments, and proportions into specific locations, humans translated transient celestial motion into stable spatial relationships. A marked location could preserve a solar extreme, a stellar rising point, or a directional axis long after the original observation had passed. These spaces were not symbolic abstractions but operational instruments. Standing in a specific location at a specific time revealed information through alignment rather than calculation. Measurement occurred through presence and observation, not through tools or numbers. The space itself performed the function of measurement. Because these spaces were shared, they standardized perception. Multiple observers could verify alignment simultaneously, reducing individual error. Sacred space functioned as a communal instrument, embedding reference into the environment rather than into personal memory. Accuracy was maintained through repeatable interaction. By embedding measurement into space, humans created durable interfaces between sky and society. Sacred spaces encoded time, direction, and proportion into architecture and landscape, allowing knowledge to survive disruption, migration, and generational turnover. Their authority derived from reliability, not belief. These locations stabilized complex celestial relationships in forms that could be reread endlessly without explanation. The language of the stars entered human systems here as fixed geometry that measured reality through alignment rather than abstraction, enabling societies to synchronize behavior, memory, and planning with external cycles using space itself as a living instrument of reference. 24. Processional architecture and embodied time. Processional architecture developed as a means of encoding time into movement rather than inscription. As societies expanded, static markers alone were insufficient to convey sequence, transition, and duration. Pathways, corridors, and aligned routes transformed celestial timing into embodied experience, allowing time to be learned through motion across space. The sky provided the temporal logic, but architecture translated it into sequence. Processional routes were aligned to solar or stellar events, guiding participants through a progression that mirrored cyclical change. Movement along these paths corresponded to phases, thresholds, or returns observed in the sky. Time was no longer only seen, it was traversed. This approach leveraged the body as a measuring instrument. Walking pace, pauses, and orientation created rhythm and duration without clocks. The length of a route, the angle of a turn, or the moment of emergence into light encoded temporal relationships directly into experience. Memory formed through repetition of movement rather than verbal instruction. Processions also synchronized groups. Collective movement reduced individual variance in timing and perception. When many bodies moved together through a structured path, alignment was enforced physically. Error became visible as misstep rather than miscalculation, maintaining coherence without abstraction. By embedding time into movement, processional architecture fused observation, memory, and behavior into a single system. The route itself preserved sequence, ensuring that celestial cycles were enacted rather than merely referenced. This transformed time from an external measure into an internalized rhythm carried by the body. The language of the stars entered human systems here as embodied time, where alignment with cosmic cycles was learned through participation. Architecture became a temporal device, guiding perception and action so that understanding emerged from motion through structured space, allowing societies to internalize long cycles through repeatable, physical experience grounded in external celestial order. 25. Proportion as structural memory. Proportion emerged as a method for preserving complex relationships when direct measurement or continuous observation was impractical. Rather than encoding exact values, early human systems stored knowledge through relational balance between parts. Proportion allowed structure to carry memory, ensuring that essential relationships persisted even when scale, materials, or context changed. Celestial observation demonstrated the effectiveness of this approach. The sky rarely offered fixed quantities, but it reliably displayed proportional relationships. Day length relative to night, the sun's height relative to the horizon, and intervals between recurring events maintained consistent ratios despite seasonal variation. These relationships could be remembered and reapplied without numerical precision. When transferred into construction and spatial design, proportion became a durable memory device. Structures built according to relational ratios preserved celestial logic even if observers no longer remembered the original observations. A building could encode seasonal balance, directional orientation, or cyclical rhythm simply through the relationships between its dimensions. This method resisted degradation. Absolute measures are vulnerable to error, loss, or reinterpretation, but proportional relationships self-correct when rebuilt or scaled. Even when materials changed or sites shifted, relational structure could be preserved. Proportion allowed knowledge to survive transmission across generations without written specification. As structural memory, proportion reduced dependence on explanation. Observers interacting with a proportional system could rediscover its logic through experience rather than instruction. The structure itself taught the relationship it encoded. This made proportion a powerful carrier of long-cycle knowledge embedded directly into the environment. By using proportion as memory, human systems translated celestial relationships into forms that endured disruption, migration, and cultural change. Buildings, spaces, and layouts became repositories of observed order, readable through interaction rather than interpretation. The language of the stars entered material culture here as preserved relationship, where memory was held not in description but in balance. Proportion ensured that even when stories faded, the underlying structure of observation remained accessible, allowing future observers to reconnect with the same external patterns that shaped the original design. 26. Redundancy as knowledge survival design. Redundancy emerged as a deliberate strategy once humans recognized that knowledge was vulnerable to loss through disruption, error, or generational break. Celestial understanding unfolded across long timescales, often exceeding individual lifespans, making single-point preservation unreliable. To survive, knowledge had to be encoded multiple times, across multiple forms, so that failure in one channel did not result in total loss. The sky itself modeled redundancy. Celestial cycles overlapped and reinforced one another. Solar position, lunar phase, and stellar appearance all conveyed temporal information independently yet coherently. If clouds obscured one signal, others remained available. This taught that reliable systems do not depend on a single indicator, but on converging confirmations. Human systems adopted this logic. Calendars were reinforced by ritual. Ritual was reinforced by architecture. Architecture was reinforced by landscape alignment. The same relationships were encoded in movement, space, story, and structure simultaneously. Even if one layer degraded, others preserved enough information to allow reconstruction. Redundancy also reduced interpretive drift. When multiple references pointed to the same pattern, deviation became visible. An error in one expression could be corrected by comparison with others. This created self-stabilizing knowledge systems that resisted distortion over time without requiring centralized control. As a survival design, redundancy transformed knowledge from fragile insight into resilient infrastructure. It ensured continuity across migration, collapse, and cultural change. The language of the stars entered human systems here as layered encoding, where truth was not stored in a single form but distributed across many. This made celestial knowledge difficult to erase and easier to rediscover. Even when meanings faded, alignments remained. Even when stories changed, proportions endured. Redundancy allowed future observers to triangulate back to original observations by cross-checking surviving elements, ensuring that essential relationships could outlast memory, belief, and even civilization itself while remaining anchored to the same external sky that generated them. 27. Myth as structural compression. Myth originated as a method for compressing complex observational knowledge into forms that could survive transmission without direct measurement. As celestial understanding expanded, not all relationships could be preserved through alignment, architecture, or ritual alone. Myth functioned as a cognitive container that preserved structure when physical reference was unavailable or incomplete. At its core, myth did not encode events but relationships. Characters, lineages, and conflicts mapped recurring cycles, transitions, and proportions observed in the sky. Sequence mattered more than narrative detail. A story preserved order, recurrence, and consequence in a form that could be remembered and repeated without specialized training or instruments. This compression reduced informational load. Rather than carrying precise spatial or temporal data, myths stored relational logic. A seasonal transition could be preserved as a journey, a stellar return as a rebirth, or a cyclical alignment as a recurring conflict and resolution. The listener did not need to see the sky directly to inherit the structure underlying it. Myth also enabled portability. Unlike fixed architecture or landscape markers, stories could travel with migrating groups. This allowed celestial frameworks to persist when physical reference points were lost. However, portability introduced risk, as interpretation could drift when verification weakened. The strength of myth lay in its ability to preserve pattern under constraint. When anchored to observation, myth acted as a mnemonic scaffold, allowing complex systems to be reconstructed by those who understood the reference. When detached, it degraded into narrative belief. As structural compression, myth was never meant to replace observation but to supplement it. The language of the stars entered human culture here as encoded relationship carried by story, preserving order when space, tools, or continuity failed. Properly understood, myth functioned as a bridge between direct observation and long-term transmission, allowing essential celestial structure to survive disruption while remaining recoverable through alignment with the same external patterns that first generated it. 28. Precision without instruments. Precision did not originate with instruments. Long before mechanical devices existed, humans achieved functional accuracy through disciplined observation, repetition, and relational reference. The sky demonstrated that precise outcomes could be obtained without measuring tools, provided that patterns were stable and attention was trained to detect small variation over time. Celestial observation required sensitivity rather than scale. The ability to notice when the sun rose slightly north or south of a previous point, or when a star appeared just before dawn rather than after, demanded refined discrimination. Precision emerged from comparison against remembered reference, not from numerical output. This approach relied on fixed anchors. Horizon points, sightlines, and alignments provided stable baselines against which change could be detected. When these anchors were preserved in space, observers could achieve remarkable accuracy through repeated verification. Precision was cumulative, improving as error was corrected across cycles. Importantly, this precision was operational. It did not aim to describe the sky exhaustively, but to act in correct relation to it. A planting aligned within a narrow seasonal window was precise enough. Navigation that reached a destination reliably did not require decimal accuracy. Precision was defined by outcome rather than representation. By developing accuracy through relational reference, early humans demonstrated that instruments are extensions of perception, not prerequisites for it. The language of the stars supported this by providing repeatable patterns against which error could be minimized. Precision without instruments trained cognition to value alignment over abstraction, reinforcing the principle that reliable action depends more on consistent reference and correction than on numerical exactness. This foundation later allowed instruments to be developed effectively, because perception was already calibrated to detect meaningful difference against stable external structure. 29. Transmission across generations. Transmission across generations became a central challenge once celestial knowledge extended beyond the lifespan of any individual observer. The sky operated on cycles that could span decades or centuries, requiring methods that allowed understanding to persist without continuous direct observation. Transmission was therefore not about copying information, but about preserving structure in a form that could be reactivated by future observers. Successful transmission relied on continuity of reference rather than continuity of explanation. Knowledge was passed in ways that allowed each generation to verify patterns independently. Alignments, proportions, rituals, and spatial markers ensured that understanding could be reconstructed through interaction with the sky itself, reducing dependence on verbal accuracy or authority. This approach minimized degradation. Instead of inheriting conclusions, new observers inherited frameworks. They learned where to look, when to look, and what relationships mattered. Verification occurred through repeated alignment between expectation and observation, allowing correction when drift occurred. Transmission remained dynamic rather than static. Social reinforcement played a key role. Collective participation in observation and timing stabilized memory across individuals. Even if some knowledge holders were lost, shared practice preserved enough structure for recovery. Transmission became distributed, reducing vulnerability to disruption. Over time, this system allowed celestial understanding to persist through migration, population change, and cultural transformation. What survived was not narrative detail but relational logic. The language of the stars entered human continuity here as recoverable structure rather than inherited belief. Each generation did not merely receive knowledge, it rederived it. This ensured resilience, because understanding remained anchored to external reality rather than internal memory alone. Transmission across generations succeeded when systems were designed so that forgetting details did not erase access. As long as the sky remained observable and reference structures endured, the core relationships could be rediscovered, allowing ancient knowledge to survive intact even as surface expressions evolved. 30. Civilization as synchronized pattern literacy. Civilization emerged when pattern literacy became synchronized across large populations. Isolated observation and local knowledge were insufficient to support complex societies. Coordination at scale required shared reference systems that aligned time, space, behavior, and expectation across many individuals simultaneously. The sky provided the only reference stable enough to support this level of synchronization. Celestial cycles offered a common framework that transcended individual perspective. When communities aligned their activities to the same solar, lunar, and stellar markers, coordination became predictable. Agriculture, construction, migration, and trade could be timed collectively rather than individually. This reduced conflict, increased efficiency, and enabled long-term planning beyond immediate survival. Pattern literacy functioned as a shared cognitive infrastructure. Individuals did not need to understand every detail of celestial behavior to participate effectively. It was sufficient that the system itself was coherent and repeatable. Calendars, rituals, architecture, and spatial layouts reinforced the same underlying patterns, ensuring alignment even when direct observation varied. Synchronization also stabilized authority without central control. Because reference was external, power did not rest solely in interpretation. When timing or alignment failed, outcomes exposed error. This constrained deviation and limited the accumulation of unverified belief. The system corrected itself through consequence rather than enforcement. As synchronized pattern literacy, civilization became an extension of celestial order into human organization. Shared alignment allowed large groups to act as coherent units across time and space. Knowledge was not centralized but distributed through structure, practice, and environment. The language of the stars entered civilization here as a coordinating substrate, shaping behavior through shared reference rather than command. This allowed societies to scale while maintaining coherence, embedding intelligence into systems rather than individuals. Civilization, at its foundation, was not defined by monuments or laws, but by the successful synchronization of human activity to stable external patterns that could be observed, verified, and re-engaged by all. Part 4. Architecture, Cities, and Landscapes. 31. Orientation of ancient cities. The orientation of ancient cities was rarely arbitrary. Urban layouts consistently reflect deliberate alignment to celestial reference rather than convenience alone. While terrain, water access, and defense influenced placement, orientation governed how a city related to time, direction, and continuity beyond immediate geography. Solar motion provided the primary orienting framework. Streets, walls, and gates were often aligned to sunrise or sunset positions at key seasonal points. This allowed the city itself to function as a large-scale reference instrument, embedding temporal awareness into daily movement. Orientation ensured that time was encountered through routine activity rather than specialized observation. Stellar reference added durability. Alignments to circumpolar stars or long-term rising points provided directional stability unaffected by seasonal variation. This allowed cities to maintain orientation across generations even as environmental conditions changed. Direction became anchored to the sky rather than local landmarks vulnerable to erosion or alteration. Orientation also standardized perception across populations. When a city faced the same directions everywhere, movement reinforced shared spatial understanding. Individuals learned direction through participation rather than instruction. The city trained orientation continuously through lived experience. By aligning cities to celestial reference, ancient builders transformed urban space into a cognitive scaffold. Orientation linked architecture, time, and movement into a unified system. The city did not merely occupy land, it encoded relationship to the sky. This ensured that daily life remained synchronized with larger cycles without requiring conscious effort. Orientation embedded pattern literacy into infrastructure, allowing entire populations to remain aligned with external order simply by living within the designed environment. In this way, cities became instruments of perception as much as centers of habitation, preserving celestial relationships through spatial organization that could endure political change, population turnover, and cultural evolution while remaining anchored to the same stable sky that guided their original design. 32. Cardinal directions and power. Cardinal directions emerged as more than navigational aids once human systems expanded beyond local movement. North, south, east, and west became organizing principles that structured space, authority, and coordination. Their power derived from consistency. Unlike landmarks, cardinal directions remained fixed regardless of terrain, season, or cultural boundary. The sky established these directions unambiguously. East and west were defined by the sun's rising and setting, while north and south were stabilized through stellar reference, particularly circumpolar motion. This created a directional framework that could be verified anywhere with sufficient observation. Direction became objective rather than negotiated. When embedded into architecture and city planning, cardinal alignment imposed order on human space. Streets, gates, and districts oriented along cardinal axes created predictable movement and shared spatial logic. Individuals navigating the city internalized direction through repetition, reinforcing common orientation without instruction. Power entered this system through control of alignment. Central structures placed at directional intersections or aligned to key celestial points signaled authority not through force but through correspondence with external order. Leadership associated itself with stability by occupying positions that mirrored the sky's structure. The use of cardinal directions transformed power from personal dominance into systemic alignment. Authority appeared legitimate when it matched external reference rather than individual will. This reduced reliance on coercion, because order was reinforced spatially. Daily movement reminded inhabitants of orientation and hierarchy simultaneously. By tying power to cardinal alignment, societies embedded governance into geometry. The city itself enforced structure through orientation, making deviation visible and stability self-reinforcing. Cardinal directions thus functioned as invisible regulators, aligning social order with cosmic reference. The language of the stars entered political space here as directional power, where authority derived from consistency with external structure rather than assertion. This integration allowed large populations to remain coordinated across time and change, because power was anchored to something that could not be moved, owned, or rewritten, the fixed directional order of the sky itself. 33. Axis Mundi concepts. The axis mundi concept emerged from the need to relate local space to a larger, stable cosmic structure. As humans embedded celestial reference into settlements, a central vertical or symbolic axis provided orientation not only across the horizon but through perceived layers of reality. This axis functioned as a spatial anchor connecting sky, land, and human activity into a single coherent framework. Celestial observation implied vertical order. The apparent rotation of the sky around a central point, particularly near the celestial pole, suggested a stable pivot amid motion. This inspired the idea of a central axis around which change occurred. Mountains, pillars, trees, and later towers were positioned or conceptualized as this axis, marking a fixed reference within a dynamic environment. In architectural terms, the axis mundi organized space hierarchically. Central points aligned to the sky became focal locations for gathering, decision-making, and coordination. Movement radiated outward from this center, reinforcing orientation through repeated use. The axis did not represent abstraction, it encoded reference by position. This central alignment also stabilized memory. By returning repeatedly to the same focal point, observers maintained continuity with celestial orientation even as surroundings changed. The axis functioned as a reset point for perception, allowing recalibration of direction and timing through alignment with external reference. The axis mundi concept integrated vertical and horizontal awareness into a unified spatial logic. It anchored human systems within a larger order by fixing a point where celestial motion, spatial orientation, and social activity converged. This transformed architecture into a reference interface rather than mere shelter. The language of the stars entered built space here as centrality, where alignment to the sky was preserved through a stable axis that structured movement, memory, and authority simultaneously. By anchoring the built environment to a fixed reference amid constant change, societies ensured that orientation remained recoverable, allowing cities and landscapes to function as living maps of external order rather than arbitrary human constructs. 34. Monument placement and sightlines. Monument placement in ancient landscapes followed precise relational logic rather than aesthetic preference alone. Large structures were positioned to establish controlled sightlines that connected human-built space with specific celestial events. These sightlines functioned as fixed observational channels, allowing transient sky phenomena to be read through stable terrestrial reference. The sky provided the moving component, while monuments supplied permanence. By aligning a structure so that the sun, moon, or a particular star appeared at a defined position relative to an opening, edge, or marker, builders transformed brief celestial moments into repeatable, verifiable events. A single sunrise or stellar rising could be recognized precisely because the built environment constrained the field of view. Sightlines also reduced ambiguity. Without reference, celestial motion can appear diffuse or gradual. When framed by architecture, small positional changes became visible and meaningful. This allowed high functional precision without instruments. The monument did not measure the sky, it filtered it, isolating specific relationships from continuous motion. These placements often worked in networks. Multiple monuments aligned to different events created a distributed observational system across a landscape. Redundancy ensured that if one marker failed or eroded, others preserved enough structure for interpretation. The landscape itself became a layered record of observation. By embedding sightlines into monumental placement, ancient societies externalized attention. The environment guided where and how to look, preserving observational skill beyond individual expertise. This transformed space into an instructional system that trained perception automatically through interaction. The language of the stars entered the landscape here as constrained vision, where alignment between stone and sky converted fleeting celestial events into durable reference points. Monument placement ensured that critical moments in cosmic cycles could be recognized, repeated, and verified across generations, allowing landscapes to function as long-term instruments that preserve timing, direction, and pattern without requiring continuous explanation or centralized knowledge holders. 35. Megaliths as timekeepers. Megalithic structures functioned as long-cycle timekeeping systems built for durability rather than fine resolution. Their purpose was not to count days but to preserve critical temporal thresholds across generations. Stone was selected because it resisted decay, ensuring that timing knowledge could outlast memory, leadership, and even culture. The sky supplied motion, while megaliths fixed reference. Large stones were positioned so that specific celestial events intersected with edges, gaps, corridors, or shadows. Solstices, equinoxes, and major lunar events became visible through interaction between light and structure. Time was revealed through alignment, not measurement. These structures minimized interpretive error. When alignment occurred, it was unmistakable. When it did not, no explanation could substitute for absence. This binary outcome enforced precision without numbers. The structure itself performed verification, eliminating reliance on authority or oral explanation. Megaliths also reduced dependence on continuous observation. Once erected, they allowed infrequent but decisive readings. Communities did not need to watch the sky daily, they needed only to recognize when critical alignments occurred. This conserved attention while preserving accuracy where it mattered most. As timekeepers, megaliths externalized memory into landscape. They transformed fleeting celestial moments into fixed reference events that could be rediscovered repeatedly. Their design favored reliability over flexibility, anchoring communal timing to external cycles that did not change. The language of the stars entered material culture here as permanent threshold markers, where stone preserved relationship rather than record. These structures ensured that long cycle time remained accessible even when observers changed, knowledge fragmented, or traditions faded. By embedding temporal intelligence into a movable form, megaliths allowed societies to remain synchronized with celestial order through direct perception, maintaining continuity across centuries without requiring explanation, calculation, or centralized control. 36. Temples as observatories. Temples originated as controlled observational environments designed to constrain perception rather than express belief. Their primary function was to translate diffuse celestial motion into discrete, repeatable events that could be verified without instruments. By shaping space, light, and movement, temples allowed precise interaction between sky cycles and human presence. The sky provided the variable element, while the temple imposed limits. Narrow corridors, apertures, aligned doorways, and enclosed chambers restricted the observer's field of view. This restriction amplified precision. When light entered a chamber or illuminated a specific surface, timing was confirmed through direct sensory outcome rather than interpretation or calculation. Architectural constraint reduced observational noise. In open landscapes, small positional changes in celestial bodies are difficult to detect reliably. Temples filtered the sky, isolating specific alignments so that even subtle shifts became obvious. Precision emerged through framing rather than measurement, allowing consistent identification of thresholds such as solstices or stellar risings. Temples also preserved knowledge across generations without requiring explanation. Even if cultural context shifted or original intent was forgotten, the effect remained reproducible. Light still appeared at the same moment, and shadow still fell in the same place. The building itself taught when to observe by producing unmistakable outcomes tied to celestial cycles. As observatories, temples embedded pattern literacy into routine movement and communal practice. They reduced dependence on continuous sky watching or specialized observers by making timing readable through architecture itself. The language of the stars entered built space here as controlled perception, where stone and geometry acted as filters translating cosmic motion into human-scale experience. Temples were not representations of the sky but operational interfaces, preserving alignment with external cycles through repeatable interaction. By constraining vision and guiding attention, they allowed societies to remain synchronized with long celestial rhythms while grounding understanding in direct, verifiable experience rather than narrative or belief. 37. Pyramids and stellar mapping. Pyramids represent an architectural solution to the problem of preserving celestial reference across extreme spans of time. Their form prioritized stability, visibility, and resistance to distortion, allowing alignments to remain readable long after surface detail, language, or cultural context changed. Shape itself became a strategy for memory. Orientation was foundational to pyramid construction. Bases were aligned to cardinal directions derived from extended celestial observation rather than local terrain. This locked the structure into a global reference frame defined by the sky, ensuring that directional accuracy persisted even as surrounding landscapes shifted or eroded. Orientation was not decorative, it was structural. Beyond direction, proportion played a critical role. Slopes, heights, and base dimensions preserved relational values rather than absolute measurements. These ratios maintained coherence even if scale varied or materials weathered. Proportion allowed meaning to survive degradation because relationship, not precision, carried the information. Stellar mapping occurred through alignment rather than depiction. Shafts, edges, and apexes were positioned so that specific stars or regions of the sky aligned at key moments. The pyramid did not display star maps, it intersected them. The sky itself completed the structure during these moments, turning alignment into verification. Through mass and geometry, pyramids externalized celestial knowledge into a movable form. Their durability ensured that orientation and stellar reference could be rediscovered through direct observation even when original knowledge systems collapsed. The language of the stars entered architecture here as preserved spatial relationship, where stone carried alignment rather than story. Pyramids functioned as long-term reference anchors, allowing future observers to recover directional and stellar context by interacting with form rather than text. This made them uniquely resilient instruments, capable of maintaining sky-based structure across centuries of cultural change while remaining verifiable through the same external patterns that guided their original construction. 38. Landscape integration. Ancient architectural systems rarely treated buildings as isolated objects placed onto neutral ground. Instead, structures were deliberately integrated into surrounding landscapes to extend observational capacity and stabilize reference over long time spans. Terrain was not background, it was an active component of celestial encoding. The horizon played a central role in this integration. Natural elevation changes created fixed rising and setting points that could be used as precise markers for solar, lunar, or stellar events. Builders selected sites where celestial motion interacted clearly with distant hills, ridgelines, or valleys, allowing timing and direction to be read through large-scale natural features rather than constructed devices alone. Landscape integration increased durability and redundancy. Unlike architecture, terrain does not collapse easily, nor does it require maintenance. If a structure eroded, sightlines anchored to mountains or horizon notches remained intact. Knowledge was distributed across land rather than confined to walls or markers, reducing vulnerability to loss. Movement through the landscape reinforced understanding. Approaching a site along a specific path revealed changing alignments between sky and terrain. This taught spatial and temporal relationships through experience rather than instruction. Navigation itself became a lesson in pattern, embedding learning into routine travel. By integrating architecture with landscape, ancient societies expanded their reference systems beyond individual structures. The environment itself became a long-term instrument capable of preserving alignment across centuries. The language of the stars entered geography here as extended alignment, where natural and built features worked together to encode timing, direction, and proportion at regional scale. This integration allowed celestial knowledge to persist even when construction degraded or populations shifted, because the land continued to present the same external reference. Landscape integration ensured that sky-based pattern literacy was anchored to features far more durable than human systems, allowing observation, verification, and rediscovery to remain possible across deep time. 39. Sacred geography. Sacred geography emerged when celestial reference was extended beyond individual sites to organize entire regions according to shared pattern. Rather than treating monuments or cities as isolated instruments, societies structured relationships between locations so that space itself encoded order. Geography became a distributed reference system aligned to the sky. Key locations were positioned relative to one another along cardinal axes, proportional distances, or repeated sightlines tied to celestial events. A mountain peak, river bend, or constructed site gained significance not in isolation but through its position within a larger network. Meaning arose from relationship, not placement alone. This regional structuring allowed large-scale coherence. Movement between sites followed paths that reenacted celestial order through travel. Direction, sequence, and timing were learned by crossing the landscape rather than by standing still. The act of moving through space reinforced temporal and spatial patterns simultaneously. Sacred geography also increased resilience. When knowledge was spread across many locations, loss of any single site did not erase the system. Remaining relationships preserved enough structure to allow reconstruction. The landscape functioned as a distributed memory, reducing dependence on centralized authority or uninterrupted tradition. By embedding celestial logic into geography, societies transformed territory into a cognitive framework. Land itself taught orientation, sequence, and proportion through repeated interaction. The language of the stars entered human systems here as relational space, where geography preserved order without requiring explanation. Sacred geography allowed pattern literacy to scale across regions and generations, ensuring that alignment with external cycles persisted even as cultures shifted. It anchored understanding not to belief or ownership, but to enduring relationships between sky, land, and movement that could be verified by anyone willing to observe and traverse the terrain. 40. Cities as sky diagrams. At their most developed, ancient cities functioned as large-scale diagrams of celestial order rather than merely dense habitations. Urban layouts encoded time, direction, proportion, and hierarchy directly into streets, districts, and monuments. The city became a readable structure where cosmic pattern was translated into daily movement and spatial experience. The sky supplied the organizing logic. Solar and stellar reference determined primary axes, while secondary streets mirrored proportional relationships observed in celestial cycles. Gates, plazas, and central structures were positioned to interact with light, shadow, and orientation at specific times. This ensured that time and direction were encountered through routine activity rather than specialized observation. Cities structured perception collectively. Residents learned orientation, rhythm, and sequence simply by living within the environment. Repeated movement along aligned streets reinforced directional awareness. Seasonal light changes interacting with architecture embedded temporal awareness into everyday experience. Pattern literacy was taught passively through participation. Urban diagrams also stabilized coordination. When infrastructure encoded the same reference everywhere, large populations could synchronize behavior without constant instruction. Markets, ceremonies, construction, and labor followed shared timing embedded into space itself. The city enforced coherence through structure rather than authority. As sky diagrams, cities represented the culmination of architectural encoding. They externalized celestial order into systems that shaped perception continuously and invisibly. Even when populations changed or meanings shifted, alignment persisted. New inhabitants inherited structure without explanation, and correction occurred through outcome rather than decree. The language of the stars entered civilization here as embedded order, where collective behavior remained synchronized with external cycles through spatial design alone. Cities did not simply reflect human intention. They preserved cosmic relationship in durable form, allowing societies to scale and persist while remaining anchored to stable, observable patterns beyond individual memory, belief, or control. Part 5. Petroglyphs and Global Markers. 41. Petroglyphs as data storage. Petroglyphs originated as a method for storing observational data in durable form when memory and oral transmission were insufficient. They were not created as art in the modern sense, nor primarily as symbolic expression. Their function was to externalize pattern into stone so that information could survive time, disruption, and generational turnover without reliance on continuous explanation. Stone offered permanence unmatched by organic materials. By carving into rock surfaces exposed to sky and landscape, observers fixed relationships between celestial events and terrestrial reference points. These markings were placed deliberately, often in locations where light, shadow, or sightlines interacted with the environment in repeatable ways. The surface became a recording medium anchored to context. Petroglyphs encoded relationships rather than narratives. Tallies, spirals, grids, and repeated forms tracked recurrence, interval, and transition. Meaning did not reside in depiction but in correspondence. A mark gained significance only when read against observation of sky, horizon, or seasonal change. The stone stored structure, not explanation. Because petroglyphs were public and durable, they standardized memory. Multiple observers could verify alignment between carving and event, reducing individual error. The rock face functioned as a shared reference, preserving consistency even when observers changed. Accuracy depended on continued correspondence, not belief. As data storage, petroglyphs represent an early information technology grounded in material permanence and environmental integration. They allowed slow celestial cycles to be tracked across centuries by anchoring memory outside the body. Their power lies in restraint, minimal marks carrying maximal relational content. The language of the stars entered human systems here as carved reference, where information survived not through story or symbol alone, but through physical inscription tied directly to repeatable external patterns. Petroglyphs preserved data in a form that could be reactivated by observation at any time, allowing knowledge to remain accessible even when its original interpreters were long gone. 42. Recurring motifs across continents. One of the most striking features of global rock art is the recurrence of specific motifs across continents separated by vast distances and cultures. Spirals, concentric circles, grids, dots, ladders, and radiating forms appear repeatedly in petroglyphs created by societies with no known contact. This consistency indicates constraint rather than coincidence, pointing to shared reference rather than shared story. These motifs correspond to simple, observable patterns rather than abstract imagination. Spirals reflect cyclical return and gradual progression. Concentric circles encode repetition around a stable center. Grids and ladders map ordered sequence, counting, or layered transition. Dots and tallies mark recurrence and interval. These forms arise naturally when humans attempt to record cyclical phenomena without writing or numbers. The sky provides the common source. Celestial motion presents repeating curves, expanding and contracting arcs, periodic return, and layered cycles operating simultaneously. When observers attempt to externalize these relationships into stone, similar constraints produce similar forms. The medium and the data shape the outcome more than culture does. Geographic separation strengthens this conclusion. When the same limited set of motifs appears in radically different environments, the explanation shifts from symbolic diffusion to functional convergence. Different groups observing the same external system, under similar cognitive limits, will arrive at comparable recording solutions. Recurring motifs therefore represent a shared visual vocabulary derived from observation, not belief. They are evidence of pattern literacy operating under universal constraints, slow cycles, limited tools, and the need for durability. The language of the stars enters the archaeological record here as convergent form, where stone carvings reflect the structure of what was observed rather than what was imagined. These motifs persist because they work. They compress complex temporal relationships into simple geometry that can be reread indefinitely when paired with continued observation of the same sky that generated them. 43. Plasma events and sky memory. Certain classes of petroglyph motifs cannot be explained solely through slow, regular celestial cycles. Highly dynamic forms such as radiating spokes, serpentine figures, stacked waves, and branching filaments suggest observation of transient, high-energy sky phenomena rather than routine motion. These markings point toward rare plasma-based events that left strong perceptual and mnemonic impact. Plasma events differ fundamentally from predictable cycles. They are episodic, intense, and visually complex. Auroral displays, electrical discharges, and atmospheric plasma phenomena can produce twisting, luminous forms that shift rapidly across the sky. When such events occur, they dominate attention and imprint memory with unusual force due to their scale, brightness, and motion. The consistency of plasma-like motifs across distant regions suggests shared experience rather than myth diffusion. Observers encountering unfamiliar but repeatable visual forms would attempt to record them using the same constrained tools available for other celestial data. Stone carving favored abstraction, capturing structure rather than detail. The resulting motifs reflect motion patterns rather than literal depiction. Sky memory plays a critical role here. Rare events are not reinforced through repetition, making them vulnerable to loss unless externalized. Petroglyphs functioned as anchors for these memories, preserving the form of the phenomenon even when frequency was low. The goal was not prediction but remembrance, ensuring that unusual sky behavior was not dismissed or forgotten. Plasma event petroglyphs represent a different category of data storage than cyclical markers. They preserve anomaly rather than regularity. This distinction is crucial for understanding their purpose. They record deviation from expected order, signaling that the sky was capable of behavior beyond normal cycles. The language of the stars enters human memory here as exception rather than rule, where stone preserves evidence of rare but powerful events that challenged expectation. By externalizing these observations, early societies maintained awareness of sky variability, embedding memory of extreme phenomena into the landscape so that future observers would recognize that the heavens were not only rhythmic, but occasionally disruptive, energetic, and transformative. 44. Spiral, circle, and wave forms. Spiral, circle, and wave forms dominate petroglyph records because they are the most efficient ways to encode continuous motion, recurrence, and flow using minimal marks. These forms are not decorative abstractions, they are geometric solutions to the problem of recording dynamic processes in static media. Stone carving favors continuity over detail, and these shapes preserve relational behavior rather than isolated moments. The circle encodes completion and return. It represents cycles that begin and end at the same reference point, such as daily solar motion, lunar phases, or annual stellar recurrence. Circles require no orientation to convey meaning. Their symmetry communicates stability and repetition independent of direction, making them ideal for marking closed temporal loops. Spirals extend the logic of the circle by adding progression. Unlike a closed loop, a spiral records motion through time where return occurs at a different scale or position. This makes spirals effective for encoding gradual change layered atop recurrence, such as seasonal drift, long-cycle stellar shifts, or cumulative processes that never reset exactly. Wave forms capture oscillation and energy transfer. Repeating peaks and troughs encode alternating states rather than return to a single point. These shapes map phenomena that fluctuate around equilibrium, such as light intensity, seasonal temperature variation, or luminous atmospheric activity. Waves preserve rhythm without implying closure. Together, these forms constitute a compact visual grammar for encoding motion. They allow observers to record how something behaves rather than what it looks like. This distinction is critical. Petroglyphs using these shapes are not symbolic shorthand, they are behavioral records. The language of the stars enters stone here as motion compressed into geometry, where continuity, progression, and oscillation are preserved in forms that remain readable without explanation. These shapes persist globally because they solve the same recording problem under the same constraints. When paired with observation, they allow future viewers to reconstruct dynamic celestial behavior from static marks, maintaining pattern literacy across time even when the original observers are long gone. 45. Handprints, grids, and tallies. Handprints, grids, and tally marks appear frequently in petroglyph records because they serve distinct and practical recording functions rather than expressive ones. These forms encode presence, count, and structure with minimal ambiguity, allowing information to be preserved in stone using the simplest possible gestures. Handprints functioned as spatial anchors. By fixing the scale and position of the human body relative to the environment, they established reference rather than identity. A handprint marked where an observer stood, reached, or oriented while recording other information. It grounded abstract pattern in physical position, linking observation to place. Grids introduced order into complexity. They partitioned space into repeatable units, allowing relationships to be tracked across rows, columns, or layers. Grids are particularly effective for organizing multi-cycle data, where several variables must be compared simultaneously. They do not depict phenomena, they structure comparison. Tallies encoded count and recurrence directly. Repeated marks tracked intervals, occurrences, or elapsed cycles without narrative. Tallies are additive by nature, making them ideal for cumulative observations such as lunar counts, seasonal returns, or repeated events. Their simplicity reduced interpretive drift. These forms work together. A handprint fixes location, a grid organizes relationship, and tallies track repetition. Combined, they form a minimal data system capable of preserving complex temporal information without language or symbolism. Meaning emerges through use, not interpretation. The persistence of these motifs across regions reflects their functional efficiency. They compress observation into durable structure while remaining verifiable through continued reference to the sky or environment. The language of the stars enters stone here as operational notation, where presence, sequence, and structure are recorded with the least possible abstraction. These marks allowed early observers to stabilize memory, coordinate verification, and extend pattern literacy beyond individual cognition, ensuring that recorded relationships could be reread, checked, and expanded over time through direct interaction rather than belief or explanation. 46. Star maps in stone. Star maps carved into stone represent an attempt to externalize spatial relationships observed in the night sky without relying on depiction or scale accuracy. Unlike modern charts, these maps did not aim to reproduce visual appearance. Their function was to preserve relative position, sequence, and orientation in a durable medium that could be re-referenced against the sky itself. The sky presents stars as fixed relationships rather than isolated points. Constellations maintain internal geometry even as they shift across the horizon and seasons. Early observers recognized that these relative arrangements were more important than brightness or individual identity. Stone carving captured these relationships through clustered points, lines, and repeated spacing rather than pictorial realism. These maps were often site-specific. Petroglyph star patterns were placed where orientation, horizon features, or architectural alignments allowed direct comparison with the sky. Meaning emerged through correspondence. A grouping carved into rock became intelligible only when viewed in the correct spatial and temporal context, reinforcing verification through observation rather than explanation. Abstraction was essential. Stone is resistant to fine detail, but well suited to preserving relative distance and alignment. By omitting scale and perspective, star maps avoided distortion over time. What mattered was which stars related to one another and how those relationships aligned with seasonal or directional markers on land. Star maps in stone functioned as spatial memory anchors rather than instructional diagrams. They allowed observers to re-establish orientation within the night sky even if oral knowledge degraded. By comparing carved relationships with observed ones, users could recalibrate direction, season, and timing. The language of the stars entered material culture here as preserved spatial logic, where stone carried relative position instead of image. These maps ensured that stellar structure could survive generational interruption, remaining recoverable through direct comparison with the same sky that originally shaped them. 47. Lunar and solar counts. Lunar and solar counts represent one of the most direct methods by which early observers translated celestial recurrence into durable record. These counts did not function as abstract numeration but as structured tracking of repeated events anchored to visible change. Counting emerged here as a consequence of observation, not as an independent invention. The moon provided the most accessible counting cycle. Its phases change in clear, discrete stages that are visible without tools and repeat with high regularity. Petroglyph tallies associated with lunar cycles often appear in grouped sequences, marking days between phases or the completion of a full cycle. These counts preserved interval rather than date, allowing recurrence to be tracked reliably without calendars. Solar counts operated at a different scale. Changes in sunrise position, day length, and seasonal extremes required longer accumulation. Tallies, notches, or grouped marks tracked progression toward solstices or equinoxes. These counts did not record every day equally but emphasized approach and threshold, reflecting what mattered operationally rather than exhaustively. Counting in stone relied on consistency rather than precision. A missed mark could be corrected through continued observation, because the sky itself provided verification. The count was meaningful only in relation to the observed cycle. This kept counting subordinate to reality rather than allowing numbers to replace reference. Lunar and solar counts functioned as external memory systems that stabilized time awareness across individuals and generations. They allowed observers to maintain continuity with cycles that extended beyond immediate perception. Importantly, these counts remained readable only when paired with observation. Without the sky, they were inert marks. With it, they became active records. The language of the stars entered material culture here as quantified recurrence, where counting served relationship rather than abstraction. These markings demonstrate that early numeracy developed as a tool for tracking natural cycles, ensuring that time remained anchored to visible return rather than detached into symbolic systems that could drift from the phenomena they were meant to represent. 48. Rock art as public record. Rock art functioned as a public recording system rather than private expression. Its placement, scale, and durability indicate intent for shared access and long-term visibility. These markings were positioned where multiple observers could encounter, verify, and reinterpret them over time, ensuring that recorded information remained part of collective awareness rather than restricted knowledge. Public placement mattered. Rock art is frequently found along travel routes, near water sources, at elevated viewpoints, or within naturally framed locations that draw attention. These sites ensured repeated exposure. Knowledge encoded there was not hidden or exclusive, it was encountered through movement and daily activity. Visibility reinforced continuity. As public record, rock art emphasized consensus over authorship. Marks were not signed or individualized. Their authority derived from persistence and correspondence with observable reality rather than from personal attribution. Anyone could compare carving to sky, season, or landscape and judge its accuracy. This reduced reliance on oral authority or lineage. Public records also stabilized memory through repetition. Seeing the same markings across years reinforced recognition of patterns they encoded. Even when interpretation weakened, form remained, allowing rediscovery through renewed observation. The record endured even when explanation faded. Rock art therefore functioned as an open archive embedded in the environment. It preserved relationships rather than messages, remaining readable through verification rather than belief. The language of the stars entered human systems here as communal record, where information was shared, durable, and self-validating. By placing data in public space, Early societies ensured that celestial knowledge remained accessible, correctable, and resilient, allowing understanding to survive interruption, disagreement, and generational change without requiring centralized control or written language. 49. Why the same symbols appear. The recurrence of the same symbols across distant regions is best explained by shared constraints rather than shared culture. Humans observing the same external system, under similar cognitive and material limitations, will converge on similar recording solutions. The sky presents a finite set of observable behaviors, and stone offers a limited set of ways to record them. Convergence is therefore expected. Celestial phenomena constrain representation. Cycles return, motion curves, light pulses, and events repeat or intensify. When observers attempt to externalize these behaviors without writing, scale, or fine tools, only certain shapes preserve the essential relationships. Spirals encode progressive return, circles encode completion, lines encode direction, and tallies encode recurrence. These are not artistic choices but functional ones. Material constraints reinforce this convergence. Stone resists fine detail but preserves broad geometry extremely well. Carving favors repetition, symmetry, and continuity over depiction. Independent groups working with similar tools and surfaces will arrive at similar forms when attempting to store the same type of information. Medium and message shape one another. Cognitive constraints further narrow outcomes. Human pattern recognition favors simple, repeatable structures that can be verified against perception. Complex symbols degrade quickly across transmission. Simple geometry remains stable. This favors symbols that compress behavior rather than appearance, reinforcing convergence across populations. The appearance of the same symbols does not imply identical meaning in isolation. Meaning emerges only through relationship to observation, placement, and use. The shared symbols indicate shared problems being solved: how to record time, motion, and recurrence in durable form. The language of the stars enters the archaeological record here as convergent notation, where different cultures independently developed the same visual grammar because they were responding to the same external order. These symbols persist globally not because ideas spread unchanged, but because reality itself imposes limits on how its patterns can be preserved. When observers work honestly within those limits, similarity is the natural result. 50. Decoding without myth projection. Decoding petroglyphs requires restraint more than imagination. The primary error in modern interpretation is the projection of later mythological, religious, or symbolic frameworks onto material that was created for operational recording. When interpretation precedes observation, meaning drifts away from function and toward narrative invention. Petroglyphs were produced under constraints of durability, visibility, and verification. Their creators relied on observable correspondence between carving, sky, and landscape. Any decoding approach that ignores placement, orientation, repetition, and environmental context discards the very mechanisms that made the marks useful. Form alone is insufficient. Relationship is the data. Myth projection occurs when symbols are treated as metaphors rather than records. Assigning gods, spirits, or stories to geometric forms bypasses the need to test correspondence. This replaces verification with explanation. Once a mark is explained, observation often stops, severing the feedback loop that originally maintained accuracy. A disciplined decoding method reverses this process. It begins with measurable factors: alignment to horizon points, interaction with light, repetition count, proximity to sightlines, and correlation with known celestial cycles. Interpretation is provisional and must remain falsifiable through continued observation. If a reading cannot be tested against reality, it is not decoding. This approach does not deny that myth later emerged around these sites. It distinguishes origin from overlay. Narrative can preserve memory, but it can also obscure structure when detached from reference. Decoding without myth projection restores the original intent: to preserve pattern, not belief. The language of the stars remains readable only when approached as a system of recorded relationships rather than a canvas for meaning-making. When observation leads and interpretation follows, petroglyphs regain their function as data anchors, allowing modern observers to recover genuine information about how early societies perceived, tracked, and interacted with celestial order. Part 6. Gods, Stories, and Astral Memory. 51. Deities as pattern carriers. Deities emerged as cognitive carriers for complex patterns that exceeded the capacity of direct observation or simple recording systems. They did not originate as supernatural explanations, but as structured representations that allowed large bodies of relational information to persist across time, language change, and social disruption. A deity functioned as a container for patterned behavior rather than as an object of belief. Celestial cycles provided the primary content for these carriers. Long-term stellar motions, seasonal solar shifts, and rare disruptive events were difficult to encode fully through architecture or petroglyph alone. By associating these patterns with named figures, societies compressed recurring relationships into stable identities that could be remembered, referenced, and transmitted without constant recalibration. These figures encoded behavior, not appearance. A deity's actions, attributes, and associations reflected observed patterns such as return, disappearance, conflict, balance, or renewal. Narrative sequences preserved order and consequence rather than literal events. The figure acted as a mnemonic framework that organized pattern into sequence. Importantly, deities maintained flexibility. Unlike fixed structures, they could adapt to environmental or cultural change while retaining core relational logic. As observation conditions shifted, attributes could be emphasized or de-emphasized without erasing the underlying pattern. This adaptability increased survivability of knowledge. As pattern carriers, deities bridged direct observation and long-term memory. They allowed societies to preserve complex celestial relationships in portable, resilient form while remaining anchored to repeatable external cycles. The language of the stars entered human culture here as personified structure, where identity served memory rather than belief. When properly understood, deities functioned as relational indexes pointing back to observable patterns, ensuring that celestial knowledge could persist even when direct reference weakened, while remaining recoverable through alignment with the same sky that originally generated the pattern. 52. Sky beings versus sky observers. Early mythological systems distinguish between beings that inhabit the sky and humans who observe it, but this distinction is often misread as literal cosmology rather than functional encoding. Sky beings did not originate as claims about physical entities living above the clouds. They emerged as narrative devices that separated observed celestial behavior from the human act of observation, preserving clarity about source and agency. Sky beings carried patterns that were not directly controllable by human action. Solar return, stellar disappearance, seasonal imbalance, and catastrophic events occurred regardless of ritual or intention. By assigning these behaviors to sky-based agents, societies encoded the fact that these patterns operated independently of human will. The sky acted, humans responded. This separation protected observational integrity. When patterns were attributed to human actors or local forces, error could be rationalized or blamed. By locating agency in the sky, deviation was recognized as misreading rather than moral failure. The model preserved accountability to observation rather than belief. Sky observers, by contrast, represented the human role, attention, memory, and alignment. Heroes, priests, or watchers did not control the sky, they interpreted it. Their success or failure reflected accuracy of reading rather than power. This maintained a clear boundary between pattern source and pattern interpretation. Over time, this distinction blurred as narrative literalism increased. Sky beings were treated as residents rather than carriers, and observers became intermediaries rather than readers. This shift obscured original function but did not erase underlying structure. Understanding sky beings as pattern carriers rather than entities restores coherence. It reveals a cognitive system designed to maintain separation between external order and internal interpretation. The language of the stars entered myth here as divided roles, the sky as generator of pattern, and humans as readers of it. This division preserved objectivity, ensuring that celestial behavior remained authoritative while human understanding remained provisional, correctable, and subordinate to observation. 53. Divine genealogies as cycles. Divine genealogies did not originate as historical family trees. They emerged as structured representations of cyclical processes observed in the sky and environment. Lineage provided a way to encode sequence, succession, and dependency without relying on abstract notation. Generations expressed order in time rather than descent in biology. Celestial cycles naturally lend themselves to genealogical structure. One phase gives rise to another, which in turn produces a subsequent state. Solar return follows decline, lunar renewal follows disappearance, and seasonal regeneration follows dormancy. Encoding these transitions as parent and offspring preserved continuity while allowing differentiation between stages. Genealogy also preserved irreversibility. Unlike simple repetition, cycles progress through distinct phases that cannot be skipped or reversed. By assigning generational order, myth encoded the necessity of sequence. A successor could not appear before its predecessor. This reinforced temporal discipline and prevented collapse of order into timeless symbolism. These structures were robust across transmission. Even when specific observational knowledge faded, genealogical order preserved relational logic. Names and attributes could change, but sequence remained. This allowed myths to survive cultural change while retaining functional structure tied to recurrence. As cyclical encoding, divine genealogies functioned as temporal maps rather than social claims. They allowed societies to track long cycles through narrative continuity, preserving order without measurement. The language of the stars entered mythology here as lineage, where descent encoded progression and inheritance encoded recurrence. When read functionally, genealogies restore access to original observational logic. They reveal systems designed to remember how cycles unfold, how states replace one another, and how return depends on prior completion. Divine lineage therefore served as a durable cognitive scaffold for tracking time at scales too large for direct perception, ensuring that celestial order remained intelligible even when observation weakened, while remaining anchored to the same recurring patterns that shaped the sky itself. 54. Death and rebirth motifs. Death and rebirth motifs emerged as narrative encodings of observable disappearance and return rather than metaphysical speculation. Early observers repeatedly witnessed cycles in which dominant celestial bodies or environmental states vanished and later reappeared. Encoding these transitions as death and renewal preserved sequence, duration, and consequence without requiring abstraction. The sky provided constant examples. Stars disappeared below the horizon for extended periods before returning. The sun reached points of apparent weakening and reversal at seasonal extremes. The moon visibly died and was reborn through its phases. These events were not symbolic inventions, they were repeated, observable processes demanding explanation and memory. Narrative framing preserved timing. Death represented absence, suspension, or decline. Rebirth marked return under altered conditions. This allowed listeners to understand that absence was not failure but part of a larger cycle. The motif protected pattern continuity by preventing misinterpretation of disappearance as termination. This encoding also preserved asymmetry. Rebirth did not restore an identical state. The sun returned stronger or weaker depending on season. Stars reappeared in shifted context. The narrative preserved the idea that cycles progress rather than loop perfectly. Change occurred within return. As a memory system, death and rebirth motifs stabilized long-cycle awareness across generations. They allowed societies to hold continuity through periods of absence without losing reference. The language of the stars entered myth here as transitional logic, where disappearance and return were treated as necessary phases of structured cycles rather than anomalies. When read functionally, these motifs restore access to observational reality, encoding how systems persist through loss, delay, and renewal. 55. Flood myths and celestial events. Flood myths originated as structured memories of large-scale disruption rather than allegorical moral tales. Their persistence across cultures reflects repeated attempts to preserve awareness of catastrophic transitions that exceeded normal cyclical behavior. These narratives encoded environmental and celestial correlations that were too infrequent, complex, or destabilizing to preserve through routine observation alone. Celestial factors played a critical role in these encodings. Changes in solar intensity, prolonged climatic shifts, and rare astronomical events correlated with environmental instability such as rising waters, altered weather patterns, or sudden ecological collapse. When these disruptions occurred, they broke expected cycles, forcing societies to account for deviation from established order. Flood narratives preserved sequence rather than detail. A period of stability is followed by warning signs, disruption, loss, and eventual restoration under new conditions. This structure mirrors observed patterns where long-term cycles are interrupted by threshold events that reset environmental baselines. The narrative retained order even when precise cause was uncertain. These myths also encoded survival logic. Selection, preparation, preservation of seed or lineage, and re-establishment of order were emphasized over explanation. This preserved actionable knowledge rather than descriptive accuracy. The myth instructed how to respond to disruption, not how to explain it. As astral memory, flood myths functioned as anomaly archives. They preserved awareness that celestial and environmental systems were capable of exceeding normal bounds. The language of the stars entered myth here as catastrophic marker, where rare but consequential events were encoded to prevent complacency. By storing disruption in narrative form, societies maintained readiness for extreme transition, ensuring that memory of instability survived long after direct observation faded, while remaining anchored to repeated patterns of breakdown and renewal observed in both sky and earth. 56. Serpents, dragons, and plasma forms. Serpents and dragons appear across global mythologies with remarkable consistency in form, motion, and behavior. These figures did not originate as zoological fantasies but as narrative encodings of observed sky phenomena that exhibited sinuous motion, branching structure, and luminous intensity. Their shared features point to a common observational source rather than cultural invention. Plasma phenomena provide a functional explanation for these forms. Auroras, electrical discharges, and high-energy atmospheric events produce twisting, filamentary structures that move dynamically across the sky. These forms can appear to coil, strike, divide, and reconnect, matching the behaviors attributed to serpents and dragons in narrative accounts. The visual similarity is structural, not symbolic. Unlike regular celestial cycles, plasma events are episodic and disruptive. Their sudden appearance, scale, and brightness command attention and imprint memory strongly. Because they do not repeat predictably, they resist calendrical encoding. Narrative becomes the preferred storage medium, preserving behavior rather than timing. Serpent and dragon figures encode motion and energy rather than identity. Their association with sky, fire, water, and boundary regions reflects the environments in which plasma phenomena are observed. Attributes such as flight, breath, or transformation map directly to luminous discharge, ionization, and dynamic flow rather than to biological traits. These figures also preserve warning. Unlike cyclical deities, serpents and dragons often signal danger, transition, or threshold crossing. This aligns with the disruptive nature of plasma events, which can coincide with environmental instability. The narrative frame preserves attentional priority, ensuring that such phenomena are remembered as significant deviations rather than ignored anomalies. As astral memory, serpents and dragons function as dynamic pattern carriers. They store information about rare, energetic sky behavior that cannot be reduced to static geometry or routine cycle. The language of the stars enters myth here as animated structure, where movement, intensity, and unpredictability are preserved through narrative form. When read functionally, these figures restore access to observational data about plasma-based sky phenomena, maintaining awareness that celestial order includes both rhythm and rupture. 57. Heroes as seasonal archetypes. Hero figures emerged as narrative encodings of recurring seasonal dynamics rather than individual historical actors. Their journeys, trials, victories, and defeats mirror the structured progression of environmental and celestial cycles that directly shaped human survival. The hero narrative functioned as a temporal map, preserving order and transition in a form that could be remembered and transmitted without measurement. Seasonal change provided the underlying structure. Periods of abundance gave way to scarcity, followed by recovery and renewal. These shifts demanded adaptation, risk, and effort. The hero embodied this process by entering challenge, enduring loss, overcoming imbalance, and restoring order. The narrative preserved sequence rather than personality. Celestial reference reinforced this structure. Solar ascent and decline, stellar disappearance and return, and seasonal extremes aligned with stages of the heroic cycle. Descent into darkness reflected periods of reduced light or harsh conditions. Return with knowledge or resource mirrored seasonal recovery. The hero did not cause change, the hero moved with it. These archetypes preserved timing logic. The hero could not succeed prematurely. Trials occurred in order, enforcing temporal discipline. This prevented collapse of narrative into timeless myth and maintained correspondence with observed progression. Sequence mattered more than outcome. As memory systems, Heroic narratives allowed societies to internalize seasonal rhythm emotionally and cognitively. They preserved not only when change occurred, but how to respond to it. The hero modeled endurance, preparation, and return rather than dominance. The language of the stars-entered story here is lived sequence, where human action was framed as alignment with recurring external patterns. Heroes functioned as seasonal carriers, encoding the logic of environmental cycles into narrative form so that societies could anticipate transition, endure disruption, and recognize renewal without direct reference to the sky. 58. Apocalypses reset cycles. Apocalypse narratives did not originate as predictions of final destruction but as encodings of observed reset cycles in both celestial and environmental systems. These stories preserved memory of periods when established order failed and was replaced by a new configuration. The term itself implies unveiling rather than annihilation, reflecting a transition rather than an end. Celestial observation revealed that cycles are not always smooth or continuous. Long-term patterns can be interrupted by abrupt shifts, such as changes in climate regime, rare astronomical events, or prolonged anomalies in solar or stellar behavior. When such disruptions occurred, prior assumptions no longer applied. Order had to be recalibrated. Apocalypse narratives preserved this logic through structure. A stable world precedes warning signs, followed by collapse, chaos, and eventual reconstitution under altered rules. This sequence mirrors observed reset behavior, where systems exceed tolerance limits and reorganize. The narrative encoded inevitability rather than morality. These stories also preserved adaptation strategy. Survival depended on recognition of thresholds, preservation of essentials, and willingness to abandon outdated structures. Apocalypse narratives taught that persistence requires transformation, not resistance to change. They framed reset as necessary rather than catastrophic. As astral memory, Apocalypse functions as a warning system embedded in story. It preserves awareness that cycles include discontinuities and that long-term stability depends on responsiveness to change. The language of the stars-entered myth here is reset logic, encoding the understanding that cosmic and environmental systems periodically reconfigure. When read functionally, apocalypse narratives restore access to observational truth. That order is provisional, cycles can break, and renewal often follows collapse. They preserve readiness for transformation, ensuring that societies remember not only how cycles repeat, but how they restart when continuity fails. 59. Why the gods look astronomical. The recurring astronomical appearance of gods across cultures is not coincidental, nor is it the result of shared fantasy. It reflects the fact that celestial patterns provided the most stable, powerful, and observable structures available to early human cognition. When complex patterns needed to be preserved, the sky supplied both the source material and the visual vocabulary. Celestial bodies exhibit behaviors that map cleanly onto narrative agency. They rise, set, disappear, return, dominate the sky, weaken, or reverse course. These behaviors resemble action more than abstraction. Encoding them as agents allowed pattern to be remembered as sequence rather than as static description. The gods look astronomical because they carry astronomical behavior. Scale also mattered. The sky operated beyond human control and beyond local causation. Encoding celestial patterns as divine preserved their non-negotiable authority. When a god acted, humans responded. This mirrored reality, where celestial cycles proceeded regardless of intention. Personification did not anthropomorphize the sky, it preserved its independence. Visual correspondence reinforced this encoding. Radiance, crowns, halos, weapons of light, animal hybrids, and vertical domains map directly to celestial brightness, motion, and position. These features were not decorative symbolism but compressed observation. The visual language matched what was seen repeatedly above. As memory systems, gods functioned as stable indices pointing back to the sky. Their stories preserved timing, sequence, and consequence while remaining portable across language and culture. When stripped of later theological overlays, their astronomical structure remains intact. The language of the stars-entered mythology here is recognizable form, ensuring that even when direct observation weakened, the patterns governing time, season, and order could still be accessed through narrative that retained the shape, behavior, and authority of the sky itself. 60. Myth as historical encoding. Myth functioned as a historical encoding system designed to preserve observational knowledge when direct records were impossible or insufficient. It did not originate as fiction or belief but as a structured method for storing sequence, causality, and consequence across long timescales. Myth preserved how systems behaved, not what people believed about them. Celestial and environmental processes provided the primary content. Cycles, disruptions, transitions, and recoveries observed in the sky and on Earth were translated into narrative sequences that could survive language change and cultural turnover. Events were not recorded literally, they were encoded relationally, preserving order and dependency rather than detail. This encoding favored structure over description. Characters, actions, and outcomes mapped to observed patterns such as recurrence, inversion, collapse, and renewal. The narrative retained timing logic even when surface elements shifted. This allowed myths to remain functional across generations that no longer shared the same observational context. Myth also preserved uncertainty. Unlike fixed records, narrative allowed for variation without erasing core structure. This flexibility ensured survival under changing conditions. What mattered was not precision, but the preservation of relationships that could be reactivated through renewed observation. As historical encoding, myth bridged direct experience and long-term memory. It allowed societies to store information about cycles, anomalies, and resets beyond the limits of individual lifespan or material record. When read without projection, myth restores access to observational history encoded in story form. The language of the stars entered human memory here as narrative structure, where history was preserved not as chronology but as patterned sequence. This ensured that knowledge of celestial behavior, environmental change, and systemic transition could persist even when instruments, architecture, or direct observation failed, remaining recoverable through alignment with the same external patterns that originally generated the record. Part 7. The Science Beneath the Sacred. 61. Astronomy versus Astrology Reframed. Astronomy and astrology originated from the same observational foundation and diverged only after different cognitive priorities emerged. Both systems began as attempts to track, correlate, and predict patterns observed in the sky. The separation between them is not ancient, it is a later distinction imposed when explanation and symbolism overtook direct measurement and verification. Early sky watchers did not distinguish between physical motion and relational meaning. The position of a celestial body mattered because it correlated with environmental change, not because it caused events through intention. What is now labeled astronomy preserved motion, geometry, and timing, while what became astrology preserved correlation, sequence, and pattern recurrence. The split reflects emphasis, not origin. Astronomy evolved toward isolation of variables. It stripped context to focus on measurable motion, mass, distance, and force. This increased precision but reduced environmental integration. Astrology retained context but gradually lost verification, relying on inherited associations rather than continuous observational testing. Both lost something essential in the process. Reframing the distinction reveals that the original system was neither predictive mysticism nor detached physics. It was applied pattern analysis. Celestial positions were read as indicators within a broader system that included climate, ecology, and human activity. Correlation preceded causation, and verification occurred through outcome. Understanding this reframing dissolves false opposition. The error was not correlation, but abandoning observation. When correlation is continuously tested against reality, it becomes data. When it is preserved without verification, it becomes belief. The language of the stars originally operated as a unified observational science, where motion and meaning were inseparable because both were grounded in repeatable pattern. Recovering this perspective restores clarity. The sky does not influence by intention, nor does it exist without relevance. It provides structured information that can be read accurately only when measurement and correlation remain coupled. 62. Precession of the equinoxes. Precession of the equinoxes represents one of the slowest and most consequential celestial motions observable from Earth. It describes the gradual shift of Earth's rotational axis, causing the positions of equinoxes to drift backward through the stellar background over a cycle of approximately 26,000 years. This motion does not alter daily experience directly, but it reshapes long-term celestial reference. Unlike daily or seasonal cycles, precession unfolds across many human lifespans. Detecting it requires intergenerational observation, careful memory preservation, and stable reference systems. The sky appears mostly unchanged within a single lifetime, which makes precession easy to miss unless comparisons are made across centuries. This constraint shaped how knowledge of it was encoded. Precession alters which stars rise at equinoxes and solstices over long periods. Constellations associated with seasonal markers slowly change, even though the seasons themselves remain tied to solar position. This decoupling between seasonal time and stellar backdrop created layered timekeeping, where short cycles remained stable while long reference frames drifted. Ancient systems accounted for this indirectly. Instead of attempting to track the full cycle explicitly, they preserved relationships through architecture, myth, and symbolic succession. Shifts in dominant deities, ages, or world eras reflect awareness that reference changes over deep time. These were not errors but adaptations to a moving background. Understanding precession reframes ancient sky knowledge as long-horizon science rather than primitive observation. It reveals that early systems recognized instability within apparent permanence. The language of the stars includes both fixed cycles and slow drift, requiring methods that preserve meaning even when reference shifts. Precession forced human cognition to confront deep time, embedding awareness that order itself evolves. This insight underlies transitions in mythic ages, architectural reorientation, and long-cycle calendars. When recognized properly, precession demonstrates that ancient sky literacy extended far beyond immediate survival, reaching into generational continuity and planetary scale motion that modern observers are only beginning to reintegrate into holistic understanding. 63. Long cycles and forgotten knowledge. Long celestial cycles operate at scales that exceed individual and often cultural memory. While daily, lunar, and seasonal patterns reinforce themselves through repetition, longer cycles unfold slowly enough to disappear from awareness unless deliberately preserved. This creates a structural vulnerability in knowledge systems. What changes too slowly is easily mistaken for permanence. The sky contains multiple long cycles operating simultaneously. Stellar drift, precession, and gradual changes in solar behavior alter reference frames over centuries and millennia. These shifts do not disrupt immediate function, which makes them difficult to notice. However, they gradually invalidate older alignments, calendars, and symbolic associations if not accounted for. Ancient systems addressed this problem through layered encoding. Instead of tracking long cycles explicitly with numbers, they preserved awareness of change itself. Myths of successive ages, shifting divine orders, and world renewals encode the understanding that reference frameworks evolve. Architecture was rebuilt, orientations adjusted, and symbols reinterpreted to maintain relevance as the background shifted. Forgetting occurred when continuity broke. Migration, collapse, or cultural replacement severed observational chains. Without awareness of long cycles, later societies inherited structures without understanding why alignment no longer worked as expected. What was forgotten was not the sky, but the rate at which it changes. This loss has modern parallels. Contemporary systems prioritize short-term precision while neglecting long-horizon drift. Climate baselines, orbital cycles, and slow systemic changes are often excluded from planning because they exceed institutional timescales. The result is surprise when gradual change becomes disruptive. Long cycles demand humility. They reveal that stability is conditional and that knowledge must be designed to survive beyond immediate usefulness. The language of the stars includes memory of slow transformation, not just repetition. When long cycles are forgotten, systems ossify. When they are remembered, societies remain adaptive, capable of revising reference without abandoning structure. 64. Catastrophism and memory. Catastrophism refers to the recognition that natural systems do not change only through slow, continuous processes, but are periodically altered by abrupt, high-impact events. In early observational cultures, this was not a theoretical position but an experiential reality. Sudden environmental shifts, extreme weather, and rare celestial phenomena disrupted established patterns, forcing memory systems to account for nonlinear change. The sky contributed directly to this awareness. While most celestial motion is predictable, occasional events break continuity. Unusual eclipses, extended atmospheric disturbances, intense auroral activity, or rare astronomical alignments. These events stood out precisely because they violated expectation. Their rarity made them difficult to encode through routine cycles, but their impact made them impossible to ignore. Human memory is poorly suited to low-frequency, high-impact events. Without reinforcement, such events fade quickly or are rationalized away. Ancient systems compensated by encoding catastrophe into durable forms: myth, monument, and ritual. These encodings did not preserve detail, they preserved warning. The goal was not explanation, but retention of significance. Catastrophic memory was often exaggerated or dramatized to ensure survival through transmission. Scale, threat, and consequence were amplified so that future generations would treat the encoded event as structurally important rather than incidental. This was a deliberate strategy, not distortion. Memory was weighted toward impact rather than accuracy to prevent dismissal. Catastrophism therefore represents a rational response to the limits of cognition and continuity. It acknowledges that systems can reset abruptly and that survival depends on remembering this possibility. The language of the stars includes not only rhythm but rupture. By embedding catastrophe into memory systems, early societies preserved awareness that order is not guaranteed by repetition alone. This allowed them to interpret sudden change not as randomness, but as part of a broader pattern landscape that includes both gradual evolution and abrupt transformation. Recognizing catastrophism restores balance to our understanding of ancient knowledge, revealing cultures that planned not only for regular cycles, but for disruption itself. 65. Earth-sky interaction. Earth-sky interaction describes the continuous exchange between celestial dynamics and terrestrial systems. Early observers did not treat the sky as separate from Earth, but as an active component of the same system influencing climate, seasons, and environmental stability. This understanding emerged from correlation rather than theory, grounded in repeated observation of how changes above coincided with changes below. Solar behavior provided the most immediate evidence. Variations in daylight length, solar angle, and intensity directly affected temperature, plant growth, and animal behavior. These effects were not subtle. They structured agricultural cycles, migration patterns, and resource availability. The sun was not a distant object, it was a regulating force embedded in daily survival. Lunar cycles revealed a different mode of interaction. Tides, nocturnal illumination, and biological rhythms correlated with lunar phases. Even without understanding gravitational mechanics, early societies recognized consistent relationships between lunar position and terrestrial response. These correlations reinforced the perception of a coupled system rather than independent domains. Stellar and longer-term celestial changes influenced Earth more indirectly. Gradual shifts in seasonal markers, altered weather baselines, and rare atmospheric events suggested that the broader sky contributed to long-horizon environmental variability. These effects accumulated slowly, making them difficult to isolate, but their persistence reinforced the idea of deep coupling. Understanding Earth-sky interaction shaped early scientific thinking as relational rather than causal. The goal was not to explain mechanism, but to maintain alignment. When sky patterns shifted, Earth systems followed, and human behavior had to adjust accordingly. The language of the stars encoded this coupling as foundational reality. Earth and sky formed a single interactive system. Recognizing this prevented false separation between environment and cosmos, ensuring that observation remained holistic. This perspective allowed early societies to adapt to change without requiring theoretical abstraction, grounding knowledge in lived correlation between celestial behavior and terrestrial consequence. 66. Resonance and harmonics. Resonance and harmonics describe how systems respond most strongly at specific frequencies or proportional relationships. Early observers did not formalize these concepts mathematically, but they recognized their effects through repeated interaction with natural systems. Certain rhythms produced amplification, stability, or coherence, while others resulted in interference or collapse. The sky provided the most consistent demonstration of this principle at scale. Celestial cycles interact through harmonic relationships. Day length, lunar phases, and seasonal solar movement form nested rhythms that reinforce or counteract one another. When cycles align proportionally, effects intensify. Periods of peak light, extreme tides, or heightened environmental activity often coincide with harmonic convergence rather than isolated motion. These correlations were observed long before their mechanisms were understood. Terrestrial systems responded accordingly. Plant growth, animal behavior, and human physiology exhibited sensitivity to rhythmic alignment. Resonance was experienced as amplification of effect rather than abstract frequency. Early societies learned that timing actions to these convergences produced better outcomes than acting against them. Harmony became operational knowledge. Architecture and ritual encoded resonance deliberately. Repeated spacing, proportional design, and rhythmic movement reinforced alignment between human activity and external cycles. Harmonic proportion stabilized structures and behavior by minimizing stress and maximizing coherence. This was not aesthetic preference but functional design. Resonance reframes ancient knowledge as systems-based rather than symbolic. It explains why proportion, rhythm, and repetition recur across disciplines. The language of the stars includes harmonic structure, where relationships matter more than isolated values. By aligning behavior, space, and timing to resonant patterns, early societies increased stability and efficiency without understanding underlying physics. Recognizing resonance restores coherence between ancient practice and modern science, revealing continuity rather than contradiction. 67. Geometry in physics. Geometry functioned as a descriptive framework for physical behavior long before formal physics existed. Early observers did not begin with equations or forces, they began with shape, proportion, and spatial relationship. The sky made this unavoidable. Celestial motion traced arcs, loops, and repeating paths that could only be understood through geometry, because geometry described how motion unfolded in space. The apparent paths of the sun, moon, and stars formed consistent curves across the sky. These curves were not arbitrary. Their angles, heights, and intersections repeated with reliable proportion. Geometry allowed observers to anticipate position, duration, and transition without measuring quantities. It captured behavior directly, encoding motion as form rather than as number. This geometric literacy extended naturally to terrestrial phenomena. Waves followed repeating spatial patterns. Growth obeyed proportional expansion. Structural stability depended on balance, symmetry, and load distribution. When the same geometric relationships appeared in sky motion and physical processes on Earth, early thinkers inferred continuity between domains. Geometry became the shared language connecting celestial order and physical reality. Modern physics did not abandon this framework, it formalized it. Orbits are geometric solutions. Fields are spatial distributions. Even forces are described through vectors, curvature, and gradients before they are calculated. Mathematics refines geometry, but it does not replace it. Equations encode relationships that are first understood spatially. Recognizing geometry as foundational reframes ancient knowledge as structurally accurate rather than primitive. Early systems identified the correct descriptive layer of reality even without symbolic formalism. The language of the stars entered science here as spatial logic, where form expresses function and relationship precedes calculation. Geometry provided a stable bridge between observation and theory, allowing understanding to persist across scale and discipline. When physics remains grounded in geometry, it stays connected to observable reality. When geometry is ignored, models drift toward abstraction detached from the behavior they are meant to describe. 68. Light, frequency, and perception. Light is not merely illumination but structured information delivered through frequency, intensity, and variation over time. Early observers did not conceptualize light abstractly, but they experienced its effects directly. Changes in brightness, color, duration, and angle altered perception, behavior, and environment in predictable ways, making light a primary carrier of usable data. Celestial light provided the most consistent reference. Solar light varied in angle and duration across seasons, shaping temperature, growth cycles, and daily rhythm. Lunar light introduced secondary modulation, altering nighttime visibility and biological activity. These variations were not random. They followed repeatable patterns that could be anticipated through observation alone. Frequency entered perception implicitly. Different qualities of light produced different effects. Low-angle light created long shadows and reduced intensity. High-angle light compressed shadows and increased energy. Shifts in coloration during sunrise and sunset signaled atmospheric change. Observers learned to associate these variations with timing and transition rather than treating light as uniform. Human perception adapted to these patterns. Vision, alertness, and behavior synchronized with light cycles. This coupling trained the nervous system to treat frequency and intensity as signals rather than background. Perception became temporal, sensitive not only to presence but to rate and change. Understanding light as information reframes early sky literacy as sensory science rather than mysticism. The language of the stars operates through modulated light, where frequency and variation encode time, position, and state. Perception evolved to decode these signals automatically, linking celestial behavior to biological and cognitive response. This relationship persists in modern science, where frequency defines energy and perception defines meaning. Early systems recognized this implicitly, grounding understanding in how light behaves and how organisms respond, long before the mechanisms were formalized. 69. Consciousness and pattern detection. Consciousness operates fundamentally as a pattern detection system rather than a passive receiver of sensory input. Early observers did not separate awareness from environment. They experienced perception as an active process shaped by repeated exposure to structured external behavior. The sky, with its slow, reliable cycles, trained consciousness to recognize order across time rather than react only to immediate stimulus. Pattern detection develops through comparison. Conscious awareness emerges when present perception is measured against memory of prior states. Celestial observation reinforced this mechanism continuously. Subtle changes in star position, day length, or light quality required sustained attention and recall. Consciousness was refined by the need to notice difference within repetition rather than novelty alone. This process shaped cognition toward expectation and correction. When a predicted pattern failed to appear, attention sharpened. Error became informative rather than confusing. Consciousness learned to remain open, provisional, and responsive to discrepancy. This prevented fixation on belief and maintained alignment with observation. Importantly, pattern detection is scale-independent. The same cognitive mechanisms used to track daily solar movement could detect long-cycle drift or rare disruption if memory systems were preserved. Consciousness expanded beyond the present moment by integrating time into perception, allowing anticipation and planning grounded in external regularity. Understanding consciousness as pattern detection reframes ancient sky knowledge as cognitive training rather than spiritual abstraction. The language of the stars shaped awareness by presenting structured information that demanded interpretation without instruction. Consciousness evolved to read relationship, sequence, and change directly from experience. This capacity underlies scientific reasoning, intuition, and learning itself. When consciousness remains engaged in pattern detection, it stays aligned with reality. When it disengages, perception collapses into reaction and belief. Early sky literacy maintained consciousness in an active, investigative state, grounding awareness in continuous comparison between expectation and observation rather than assumption. 70. Reality is structured information. Reality presents itself not as a collection of isolated objects but as structured information unfolding through time. Early observers inferred this through repeated engagement with the sky, where position, motion, intensity, and recurrence conveyed usable data without explanation. The consistency of these patterns revealed that order preceded interpretation, and that information existed independently of belief. Structured information is defined by relationship. A single observation carries limited meaning until placed within sequence and comparison. Celestial behavior made this explicit. The value of a sunrise lay not in the event itself, but in its position relative to prior and future sunrises. Information emerged from difference within continuity, not from singular moments. This structure imposed constraints on interpretation. Patterns could be misread, but they could not be negotiated. When expectation diverged from outcome, correction was required. This enforced objectivity without theory. Reality communicated through repeatable behavior, and understanding depended on accurate decoding rather than narrative coherence. Human systems evolved to mirror this structure. Geometry, proportion, rhythm, and sequence all reflect attempts to align cognition with informational order. These tools did not create structure, they mapped it. When aligned, prediction improved. When misaligned, consequence followed. Information remained external, authoritative, and testable. Understanding reality as structured information dissolves the divide between ancient observation and modern science. The language of the stars did not convey meaning symbolically, it transmitted data through pattern. Light carried timing, motion carried sequence, and repetition carried reliability. Early societies learned to read this information directly, grounding knowledge in correspondence rather than explanation. This perspective restores continuity between perception and reality, where understanding is defined by alignment with structure rather than interpretation layered on top. When reality is approached as information, cognition becomes an interface rather than a filter, and knowledge remains provisional, correctable, and anchored to what is actually occurring. Part 8. The Human Interface. 71. The brain is a pattern filter. The human brain does not record reality directly. It filters incoming information to extract patterns that are useful for prediction and action. This filtering is not a flaw but a necessity. The volume of sensory input far exceeds what conscious awareness can process, forcing the brain to prioritize structure over detail. Vision provides a clear example. The eyes receive continuous streams of light, yet perception stabilizes objects, motion, and boundaries by suppressing noise. Change is emphasized over constancy. This same mechanism operates in temporal perception, where repeated patterns are compressed into expectation while deviations trigger attention. The brain learns reality by detecting difference within repetition. Sky observation refined this filtering capacity. Celestial patterns change slowly and predictably, demanding sustained attention across long intervals. To track them, the brain had to integrate memory with perception, comparing present input against internal models. This trained cognition to operate across time rather than reacting only to immediate stimulus. Filtering also introduces bias. Once a pattern is learned, the brain expects it. Unexpected data may be ignored or misinterpreted unless attention is deliberately maintained. Early observational systems countered this by enforcing verification through alignment and consequence. When expected patterns failed, survival demanded correction, keeping filters adaptable. Understanding the brain as a pattern filter reframes perception as an active interface with structured information. The language of the stars trained this interface by presenting stable, testable patterns that rewarded accuracy and punished assumption. This kept filtering aligned with reality rather than belief. When pattern filters remain flexible, cognition stays accurate. When they harden into expectation without verification, perception detaches from structure. Early sky literacy maintained this balance, shaping brains that filtered for relationship, sequence, and change while remaining open to correction through direct observation. 72. Dreams as symbolic processing. Dreams function as an internal processing layer where the brain reorganizes patterns gathered during waking perception. They do not introduce new information but recombine existing data into symbolic form, allowing unresolved relationships to be explored without immediate sensory constraint. This makes dreams a natural extension of pattern literacy rather than a separate mental phenomenon. During waking observation, especially of slow or complex systems like celestial cycles, the brain accumulates incomplete patterns. These fragments cannot always be resolved through direct attention alone. Dreams provide a low-stakes environment where these fragments are tested, rearranged, and integrated. Symbolism emerges because the brain compresses relational data into experiential imagery. Celestial observation historically fed this process. Long intervals between observable events left gaps that required internal modeling. Dreams allowed the mind to simulate transitions, reversals, and returns that were not immediately visible. This helped maintain continuity of understanding across time, especially when direct verification was delayed. Dream symbols follow structural logic rather than narrative coherence. Repetition, transformation, inversion, and sudden transition dominate dream content because these mirror how patterns behave rather than how stories unfold. This aligns with how the sky operates, where cycles repeat, invert, or shift context without intention. Understanding dreams as symbolic processing reframes them as cognitive tools rather than messages or omens. The language of the stars influenced this layer by training the brain to work relationally, using symbol to represent pattern instead of literal depiction. Dreams allowed early observers to maintain engagement with long cycles beyond waking attention, reinforcing pattern literacy internally. When approached this way, dreams reveal how cognition continues observation even when sensory input pauses, preserving alignment with structured reality through symbolic simulation rather than belief. 73. Synchronicity and attention. Synchronicity arises when attention aligns with structured patterns already present in reality. It is not a causal phenomenon, but a perceptual one. Events appear meaningful when the observer's pattern filter is tuned finely enough to detect correspondence across domains that normally remain unnoticed. The experience reflects alignment between cognition and structure, not intervention by external agency. Attention determines what patterns become visible. When awareness is diffuse, relationships blur into background noise. When attention is focused, correlation emerges. Celestial observation trained this faculty extensively. Tracking slow cycles required sustained focus over long intervals, sharpening sensitivity to timing, recurrence, and deviation. This trained the mind to notice alignment rather than isolated events. Synchronicity becomes noticeable when internal models and external events converge. An anticipated pattern manifests in multiple contexts simultaneously, creating a sense of coherence. This does not imply intention in the system, but accuracy in the observer's model. The more refined the pattern literacy, the more frequently such convergence is perceived. Misinterpretation occurs when synchronicity is treated as message rather than signal. Assigning agency or purpose obscures the underlying mechanism. Attention amplifies correlation. Without continued verification, perceived meaning detaches from structure and becomes belief. Early systems countered this by requiring repeated correspondence rather than singular coincidence. Understanding synchronicity as an attentional effect restores it to observational science. The language of the stars trained awareness to detect real alignment across time, space, and behavior. When attention remains disciplined, synchronicity reflects genuine structural coherence. When attention drifts toward narrative, it becomes projection. Properly understood, synchronicity signals that perception is correctly tuned to pattern, not that reality is responding personally. 74. Intuition versus data. Intuition is often mischaracterized as information without evidence, when in reality it is rapid pattern synthesis operating below conscious articulation. It emerges from accumulated observation compressed into immediate response. Data, by contrast, is pattern made explicit through measurement, recording, and comparison. Both arise from the same source, repeated interaction with structured reality. Intuition develops when the brain has absorbed sufficient relational information to predict outcome without stepwise reasoning. Celestial observation cultivated this capacity strongly. Long exposure to slow, regular cycles trained observers to sense timing, transition, and deviation before they could describe them numerically. Intuition was not guesswork, it was unspoken accuracy. Data formalizes intuition by externalizing pattern. Tallies, alignments, calendars, and later instruments translated sensed relationships into shared reference. This allowed verification beyond individual perception. However, data without intuition becomes brittle. It captures past conditions but cannot adapt quickly to subtle change without interpretation. The tension between intuition and data emerges when one is privileged without the other. Intuition without verification drifts toward projection. Data without contextual understanding becomes blind to relevance. Early systems avoided this split by grounding intuition in observation and testing it continuously against outcome. Accuracy determined validity, not confidence. Understanding intuition and data as complementary restores balance. Intuition provides speed and adaptability, data provides stability and correction. The language of the stars trained both simultaneously. Pattern was first felt, then checked, then preserved. When intuition aligns with data, understanding deepens. When they diverge, recalibration is required. Properly integrated, intuition functions as fast pattern recognition guided by accumulated data, while data serves as shared memory that keeps intuition tethered to reality. 75. Training pattern literacy. Pattern literacy is the disciplined ability to recognize, compare, and validate structured relationships across time. It is not intuitive guesswork or symbolic interpretation, but a learned capacity built through sustained exposure to repeatable systems. Early societies trained this skill because accurate pattern recognition directly determined survival, coordination, and continuity. Training begins with extended observation of stable phenomena. Short exposure produces familiarity, but literacy requires duration. Celestial cycles provided ideal training material because they unfold slowly and predictably, forcing attention to remain engaged across long intervals. The observer learns not by novelty, but by noticing small differences within repetition. Comparison is the core mechanism. Each new observation is evaluated against memory of previous states. Pattern literacy develops when the mind can hold multiple temporal snapshots simultaneously and detect relational change. Fixed references such as horizon markers, sightlines, or tallies externalized memory, allowing attention to focus on difference rather than recall. Error correction is essential. Patterns are not learned through confirmation, but through mismatch between expectation and outcome. Early systems enforced correction through consequence. Mistimed actions produced visible failure, preventing false certainty. This trained cognition to remain provisional and responsive rather than confident and static. Effective training avoids narrative overlay. Stories may preserve memory, but literacy depends on verification. Pattern recognition must remain anchored to observable correspondence, not explanation. This keeps internal models flexible and correctable. Training pattern literacy transforms perception from reactive to predictive. The observer no longer waits for events to occur, but anticipates transition based on relational change. The language of the stars refined this capacity by offering continuous, unbiased feedback. When cultivated deliberately, pattern literacy aligns cognition with structured reality, enabling accurate anticipation, disciplined intuition, and adaptive response grounded in observable behavior rather than belief. 76. Why some see and others don't. Differences in perception do not arise from access to different realities, but from differences in trained attention. Everyone receives the same sensory input, yet not everyone extracts the same structure from it. What separates those who perceive pattern from those who do not is not intelligence or belief, but the calibration of attention over time. Pattern recognition requires sustained engagement with slow systems. Many environments reward reaction to immediate stimulus rather than comparison across intervals. When attention is trained for speed instead of continuity, long-term structure becomes invisible. Celestial patterns, seasonal drift, and gradual change are missed because they do not demand instant response. Memory integration is a second factor. Seeing pattern requires holding previous states alongside present perception. When memory is fragmented or overridden by constant novelty, comparison collapses. Without stable reference, change cannot be measured, only experienced as noise. Early observational cultures protected memory through markers, ritual, and repetition to prevent this loss. Expectation also shapes visibility. Once a cognitive model hardens, perception filters for confirmation rather than correspondence. Deviations are ignored or rationalized away. This creates the illusion that nothing new is occurring. Observers who remain flexible detect change because they allow expectation to be challenged by outcome. Social environment reinforces these differences. Systems that reward certainty discourage revision. Systems that reward accuracy enforce correction. Over time, this determines whether perception sharpens or dulls. Pattern literacy thrives where error is informative rather than threatening. Understanding why some see and others do not restores clarity without mystification. Perception is trainable, degradable, and correctable. The language of the stars does not hide itself, it remains constant. What changes is the observer's capacity to remain attentive across time, integrate memory, tolerate uncertainty, and revise internal models. Those who cultivate these traits see structure emerge naturally. Those who do not experience the same reality as disconnected events. The difference lies not in vision, but in disciplined attention. 77. Cultural filters and blind spots. Cultural filters shape perception by determining which patterns are considered relevant and which are ignored. These filters are not consciously chosen. They emerge from shared habits, priorities, and reinforcement structures within a society. Over time, they act as perceptual constraints, narrowing attention to approved signals while rendering others effectively invisible. Every culture trains pattern literacy selectively. Skills that support economic activity, social order, or technological function are emphasized, while patterns outside those domains receive less reinforcement. This does not eliminate perception, but it deprioritizes it. The sky, once a central reference, becomes background when cultural systems no longer depend on it for coordination. Blind spots arise when filters become rigid. When a society assumes stability in certain domains, it stops monitoring them closely. Slow change goes unnoticed until thresholds are crossed. Celestial drift, environmental degradation, and long-cycle variability often fall into these blind zones because they do not align with short-term feedback loops valued by modern systems. These blind spots are self-reinforcing. When a pattern is not culturally acknowledged, individuals lack language, tools, or validation to explore it. Observations that fall outside accepted frameworks are dismissed or pathologized. This discourages sustained attention, further weakening detection capability across generations. Cultural filters do not block reality, they redirect attention. What is filtered out does not disappear, but it ceases to inform decision-making. Restoring pattern literacy requires loosening these filters deliberately, reintroducing long-horizon observation and cross-domain comparison. The language of the stars highlights this limitation clearly. Celestial patterns persist regardless of cultural focus. When societies stop attending to them, blind spots grow. When attention is retrained, structure reappears. Perceptual clarity therefore depends not on changing reality, but on adjusting the cultural frameworks that determine what is seen, remembered, and acted upon over time. 78. Modern disconnection from the sky. Modern societies are largely disconnected from the sky as a functional reference system. This disconnection is not caused by ignorance of astronomy, but by the removal of direct dependency. Time, navigation, climate control, and coordination are mediated through technology, reducing the need for sustained observation of celestial behavior. What was once operational has become abstract. Artificial lighting is a primary factor. Continuous illumination disrupts natural light cycles, flattening contrast between day, night, and seasonal variation. Subtle changes in solar angle, twilight duration, and lunar brightness become imperceptible. Without darkness and variation, the sky loses informational value and becomes visual background rather than structured signal. Timekeeping technologies further accelerate this separation. Clocks and calendars provide precise outputs without requiring engagement with reference. While efficient, they detach timing from observation. When systems fail or drift, users lack the perceptual framework to detect error. Time becomes assumed rather than verified. Urban design compounds the effect. Buildings block horizons, obscure sightlines, and fragment sky visibility. Movement occurs indoors or under artificial reference, preventing routine alignment with external cycles. The environment no longer teaches orientation, direction, or rhythm through daily interaction. This disconnection reshapes cognition. Without regular exposure to slow, stable cycles, attention becomes tuned to immediacy. Long-term pattern detection weakens, and gradual change is perceived only when consequences are unavoidable. The language of the stars does not disappear, access to it degrades. Restoring connection does not require abandoning technology, but reintroducing observational grounding. When the sky is re-engaged as reference rather than spectacle, perception regains depth. Modern disconnection is not permanent, but it is cumulative. Reversing it requires deliberate reintegration of sky awareness into daily life, environment, and attention so that structured external patterns once again inform internal models of time, change, and continuity. 79. Relearning observational skills. Relearning observational skills requires reversing habits formed in environments where reference is outsourced rather than engaged. Modern perception is optimized for rapid response, not sustained comparison. To regain pattern literacy, attention must be retrained to operate across time, holding continuity rather than reacting to immediacy. The first step is restoring stable reference. Observation depends on fixed points against which change can be measured. This means repeated engagement with the same horizon lines, sky regions, or light conditions over extended periods. Without consistency, perception cannot detect drift. Observation is built through return, not novelty. Duration is critical. Short sessions produce awareness, long sessions produce calibration. The brain must experience patterns unfolding slowly to internalize rate, sequence, and deviation. Celestial cycles remain ideal training material because they change just slowly enough to demand memory integration. Observation must extend beyond curiosity into routine. Error tolerance is equally important. Relearning requires allowing expectations to fail without reinterpretation. When predicted changes do not occur, the observer must pause rather than explain. This preserves correction. Early systems treated mismatch as signal, not as threat. Modern observers must relearn this discipline. Relearning observational skill ultimately restores perception as an active interface rather than a passive feed. The observer regains the ability to detect structure without explanation, to anticipate change without narrative, and to revise internal models without defensiveness. The language of the stars supports this retraining because it offers stable, unbiased feedback. When attention is sustained, memory integrated, and correction allowed, perception sharpens naturally. Observational skill does not require belief, tools, or theory. It requires patience, consistency, and willingness to let reality teach through repetition. When these conditions are restored, pattern literacy re-emerges, reconnecting cognition to external structure and re-establishing the capacity to read change before consequence forces recognition. 80. The return of sky awareness. The return of sky awareness does not require recovering ancient beliefs or abandoning modern tools. It requires restoring the sky to its role as a continuous reference system rather than a distant object of study. Awareness begins when the sky is re-engaged as an active source of structured information that can be read, compared, and verified through direct observation. This return starts with re-establishing temporal sensitivity. Observers must relearn to notice gradual change rather than isolated events. Shifts in daylight length, solar angle, twilight duration, and stellar position provide constant feedback about time and season. When these signals are attended to regularly, internal timing recalibrates without reliance on devices. Spatial awareness follows. The sky provides stable orientation cues that reconnect perception to direction and scale. Cardinal direction, horizon reference, and vertical motion restore embodied orientation that modern environments often suppress. This grounding sharpens navigation, memory, and situational awareness by relinking cognition to external structure. Sky awareness also restores humility in interpretation. Unlike mediated data, celestial patterns cannot be negotiated or customized. They unfold regardless of preference. This enforces correction when expectation diverges from reality. The observer must adapt rather than explain, maintaining alignment through attention rather than belief. The return of sky awareness ultimately reintegrates perception with long horizon structure. It expands cognition beyond immediacy, reconnecting thought to cycles that exceed individual lifespan. This does not diminish modern knowledge, it stabilizes it. When the sky is restored as reference, internal models regain depth, patience, and accuracy. The language of the stars resumes its role as an external tutor, continuously refining perception through repetition, comparison, and correction. Sky awareness returns when observation becomes routine rather than exceptional, allowing structured reality to inform cognition directly. Part 9. Reassembling the Blueprint. 81. Fragmentation of ancient knowledge. Fragmentation of ancient knowledge did not occur through a single collapse, but through gradual separation of systems that were originally integrated. Observation, architecture, ritual, narrative, and environment once functioned as a unified framework for preserving pattern literacy. When these elements were isolated or repurposed independently, the coherence of the system degraded even if individual components survived. Celestial reference was the first element to weaken. As societies developed alternative methods for timekeeping, navigation, and coordination, direct reliance on the sky diminished. Observation became specialized rather than communal. Without continuous engagement, long-cycle awareness faded, and systems designed to encode it lost functional context. Transmission suffered next. Structures and stories persisted, but the feedback loop that linked them to verification was interrupted. Architecture remained, but alignment was no longer checked. Myths were repeated, but no longer tested against observation. What had once been adaptive systems hardened into tradition, preserving form while losing function. Power consolidation accelerated fragmentation. When authority replaced reference, interpretation displaced verification. Knowledge became something to inherit rather than rederive. This shift discouraged correction and rewarded consistency over accuracy. Fragmented elements were preserved selectively, often stripped of their relational grounding. Fragmentation does not imply loss of intelligence, but loss of integration. The pieces still exist. Alignments, symbols, proportions, narratives. What is missing is the connective logic that allowed them to operate as a single system. Reassembling the blueprint requires recognizing that ancient knowledge was not compartmentalized. It was systemic. The language of the stars once unified perception, memory, environment, and behavior. Fragmentation occurred when these domains were separated. Recovery therefore depends not on discovering new information, but on restoring relationship between surviving elements so that observation, verification, and transmission can operate together again. 82. Religion, power, and obfuscation. Religion became a vehicle for obfuscation when power replaced observation as the organizing principle. Early systems grounded authority in correspondence with external reference. When alignment failed, outcomes exposed error. Over time, this accountability weakened as interpretive control centralized and verification was displaced by doctrine. Celestial knowledge was especially vulnerable to this shift. Because sky-based systems required patience, correction, and intergenerational continuity, they were difficult to monopolize without suppressing observation itself. By reframing celestial patterns as the actions of exclusive agents rather than repeatable processes, interpretive authority could be claimed without reference to outcome. Ritual and myth were repurposed in this transition. What had functioned as timing enforcement and memory scaffolding became tools of compliance. Participation replaced verification. Meaning was asserted rather than tested. As belief hardened, deviation from doctrine was treated as disobedience rather than error, severing the feedback loop that preserved accuracy. Power consolidation favored opacity. Systems that could not be easily checked allowed hierarchy to persist without correction. Complex calendars, symbolic language, and restricted knowledge access replaced simple, observable reference. This did not require inventing falsehoods, it required withholding context. Obfuscation thrived where alignment could no longer be independently verified. Understanding this process is essential for reassembly. The loss was not knowledge, but access. When observation is restored, obfuscation dissolves naturally because structure reasserts itself. The language of the stars does not submit to authority. It remains readable wherever attention, patience, and verification are allowed. Reassembling the blueprint therefore requires disentangling pattern from power, restoring external reference as the arbiter of accuracy, and recognizing that any system requiring belief without verification has already departed from the observational framework that originally gave it coherence. 83. What was lost and why? What was lost from ancient knowledge systems was not information itself, but the operational framework that kept information accurate. Observation, verification, correction, and transmission once formed a closed loop. When that loop broke, knowledge fragments persisted without the mechanisms required to maintain coherence. Loss occurred through disconnection, not destruction. The primary loss was continuous reference. Ancient systems depended on repeated engagement with external patterns, especially the sky, to recalibrate understanding. When societies shifted toward mediated timekeeping, enclosed environments, and abstract authority, this reference weakened. Knowledge no longer refreshed itself against reality, allowing drift to accumulate unnoticed. Another loss was collective participation. Pattern literacy was once distributed across populations through shared observation, ritualized timing, and spatial design. As specialization increased, observation became the domain of elites while the majority inherited conclusions without process. This reduced redundancy and made systems fragile. When specialists disappeared or were ignored, recovery became difficult. Language also contributed to loss. Narrative survived more easily than structure. Stories were preserved because they were memorable, while the observational logic embedded within them was not explicitly taught. Over time, meaning detached from function. Symbols remained, but the conditions required to decode them were forgotten. The loss was reinforced by success. When systems worked well enough in the short term, long-horizon awareness appeared unnecessary. Gradual drift went unnoticed until misalignment produced crisis. By then, corrective knowledge was fragmented or inaccessible. Understanding what was lost clarifies the path forward. The missing element is not hidden data or suppressed truth, but integrated practice. Reassembling the blueprint requires restoring the conditions that kept knowledge alive: external reference, shared verification, error correction, and intergenerational continuity. The language of the stars remains intact. What failed was not the sky, but the human systems designed to stay aligned with it. 84. Modern science rediscovering old truths. Modern science has not overturned ancient observational insights so much as rediscovered them through different tools. Many principles now treated as recent breakthroughs were functionally understood long ago through pattern correlation, spatial reasoning, and long-term observation. What changed was not reality, but method and scale of verification. Early observers worked from outcome backward. They tracked what repeated, what shifted, and what broke continuity. Modern science often works from model forward, testing predictions through controlled measurement. These approaches converge when systems are well understood. They diverge when long horizons or complex coupling exceed experimental limits. Examples of convergence are widespread. Cycles, feedback loops, resonance, phase transition, and systems instability are now formal scientific concepts. These map directly onto ancient understandings of recurrence, alignment, threshold, and reset. What was once encoded in architecture or narrative is now expressed through equations and simulations. Rediscovery occurs because structure persists even when language changes. When modern tools isolate variables successfully, they often reveal relationships that ancient systems preserved holistically. The difference lies in resolution, not in fundamental insight. Ancient systems emphasized integration. Modern science emphasizes isolation. Each corrects the other's blind spots. Reassembling the blueprint requires recognizing this continuity without collapsing distinction. Ancient knowledge should not be romanticized, nor modern science dismissed. The recovery lies in integration. Long-term observation, environmental coupling, and external reference must be reintegrated into scientific thinking where laboratory constraints limit horizon. The language of the stars reminds science that not all systems reveal themselves under short-term testing. Some truths require patience, continuity, and distributed observation across generations. Modern science rediscovers old truths when it expands beyond immediacy and re-engages with structure unfolding over time. When this occurs, ancient insight is no longer seen as precursor myth, but as early systems science grounded in disciplined attention to reality itself. 85. Cross-cultural convergence. Cross-cultural convergence refers to the independent emergence of similar structures, symbols, and systems across societies with no direct contact. This convergence is not evidence of shared mythology or diffusion, but of shared constraint. When different cultures observe the same external patterns under similar cognitive and material limits, their solutions converge naturally. The sky is the strongest source of this convergence. Celestial cycles are global, stable, and indifferent to culture. Day and night, seasons, lunar phases, and stellar motion impose the same constraints everywhere on Earth. Societies attempting to coordinate survival around these patterns inevitably develop comparable reference systems, regardless of language or belief. Material and cognitive limits further narrow outcomes. Without writing, instruments, or abstraction, only certain structures preserve timing and relationship reliably. Geometry, proportion, alignment, repetition, and narrative sequence emerge repeatedly because they work. These forms are not symbolic preferences, they are functional solutions to the same recording problem. Convergence also appears in architecture, calendrics, and mythic structure. Similar orientations, proportional systems, and cyclical narratives arise because they encode observable relationships efficiently. Differences in surface expression mask deeper structural similarity. What converges is not story detail, but pattern logic. Cross-cultural convergence is therefore diagnostic rather than mysterious. It indicates that systems are responding correctly to reality rather than inventing arbitrarily. When independent observers arrive at the same structural solutions, the likelihood of correspondence increases. This principle underlies modern science as well. Reproducibility across independent contexts validates model accuracy. Reassembling the blueprint requires treating convergence as evidence of constraint-driven design. Instead of asking why cultures shared symbols, the correct question is why those symbols worked. The language of the stars imposes limits on how its patterns can be preserved. When humans operate within those limits honestly, similarity emerges. Cross-cultural convergence reveals not shared belief, but shared alignment with the same external order, demonstrating that ancient knowledge systems were grounded in reality rather than imagination. 86. Rebuilding the map without myth. Rebuilding the ancient knowledge map requires separating functional structure from narrative overlay. Myth preserved memory, but it also accumulated interpretation that obscured original reference. To restore usability, the task is not to decode symbols symbolically, but to reconstruct the relational framework that generated them. The first step is reinstating external reference. Any recovered element must be testable against observable reality. Alignment, proportion, timing, and recurrence are the criteria. If an interpretation cannot be checked through observation or outcome, it does not belong to the reconstructed map. This immediately filters out speculative layering. Next is restoring relational context. No element functioned alone. Architecture, story, ritual, and landscape formed interlocking systems. Removing myth does not mean removing narrative entirely, but stripping it down to sequence and dependency. What matters is order, transition, and constraint, not character or moral framing. Rebuilding also requires resisting replacement mythology. Modern systems are prone to substituting scientific language for symbolic belief without restoring verification. Models become narratives when they are insulated from correction. The rebuild map must remain provisional, open to revision as reference shifts or expands. This process favors simplicity. The most reliable ancient systems were minimal. They encoded only what could be preserved accurately across time. Overcomplication signals loss of reference. Rebuilding demands reduction, not expansion, until structure becomes readable again. Rebuilding the map without myth restores the original intent, a system that remains aligned because it is continuously checked against reality. The language of the stars does not require story to function. It requires attention, patience, and correction. When myth is removed, what remains is not emptiness, but a clear framework of relationships that can be reassembled, tested, and extended. This approach allows ancient knowledge to re-enter modern understanding without distortion, grounding recovery in structure rather than belief. 87. Ethics of knowledge recovery. Recovering ancient knowledge is not a neutral act. It carries ethical responsibility because restored understanding alters perception, decision-making, and power distribution. When knowledge is reassembled without restraint, it can be misused, mythologized again, or leveraged for control rather than alignment. Ethics therefore become integral to recovery, not an external consideration. The original systems were constrained by verification. Knowledge remained ethical because it could be checked against reality. When outcomes failed, correction followed. Any modern recovery effort must preserve this constraint. Claims that cannot be independently verified invite authority and belief to replace correspondence, recreating the conditions that caused fragmentation. Accessibility is another ethical dimension. Ancient pattern literacy was distributed, not exclusive. When recovery becomes gated by specialization or mystique, it reproduces hierarchy. Ethical reconstruction favors transparency, simplicity, and repeatability. Anyone willing to observe and compare should be able to engage the system without initiation or deference. Context also matters. Removing myth does not mean stripping meaning indiscriminately. Narrative preserved caution, memory, and respect for limits. Ethical recovery preserves warning while removing authority. It retains awareness of consequence without assigning obedience to interpretation. Finally, restraint is essential. Not all recovered knowledge should be applied immediately or universally. Some patterns operate at scales that require collective readiness to interpret responsibly. Ethics demand pacing recovery with comprehension, ensuring understanding precedes implementation. The ethics of knowledge recovery align with the original design principle. Knowledge serves alignment, not dominance. The language of the stars imposes humility because it cannot be controlled. When recovery honors this constraint, it restores understanding without recreating the structures that obscured it. Ethical reconstruction ensures that recovered pattern literacy strengthens collective coherence rather than becoming another instrument of distortion or power. 88. Empowerment through understanding. Empowerment through understanding does not arise from possessing hidden knowledge, but from restoring accurate relationship with observable reality. Ancient systems empowered individuals by teaching them how to read patterns directly rather than depend on authority or explanation. Understanding reduced vulnerability by increasing predictability and responsiveness. True empowerment is structural. When individuals can verify timing, alignment, and change through observation, they regain agency over decision-making. Actions are chosen based on correspondence rather than instruction. This shifts power from hierarchy to competence. Knowledge becomes something practiced, not granted. Understanding also limits manipulation. Systems grounded in external reference cannot be easily distorted without consequence. When alignment fails, outcomes reveal error. This transparency prevents consolidation of power through narrative alone. Empowerment emerges naturally when verification replaces belief. Importantly, empowerment does not imply control. Ancient pattern literacy taught adaptation, not dominance. The sky could not be commanded, only read. This cultivated humility alongside competence. Understanding increased effectiveness without encouraging illusion of mastery. Human action remained bounded by external structure. Reassembling the blueprint restores this form of empowerment. It equips individuals and societies with tools to anticipate change, recognize thresholds, and respond coherently without relying on centralized interpretation. The language of the stars empowers because it remains indifferent to status, belief, or intention. Anyone willing to observe, compare, and correct can engage it. This democratization of understanding is its ethical core. When empowerment is rooted in accurate perception rather than authority, systems become resilient. Understanding strengthens autonomy while preserving alignment, ensuring that empowerment enhances collective stability rather than fragmenting it through unchecked assertion. 89. Collective intelligence. Collective intelligence emerges when pattern literacy is distributed across a population rather than concentrated in individuals or institutions. Ancient systems achieved this by embedding reference into environment, practice, and shared timing. Intelligence was not stored in minds alone, but in coordinated interaction with external structure that everyone could access. The sky enabled this distribution. Because celestial patterns were visible to all, no single observer owned reference. When communities aligned their behavior to shared cycles, accuracy improved through redundancy. Multiple observers cross-checked expectation against outcome, correcting error without centralized enforcement. Intelligence became emergent rather than hierarchical. Collective intelligence depends on synchronization, not uniformity. Individuals do not need identical interpretations, they need shared reference. When everyone measures against the same external pattern, variation becomes informative rather than disruptive. Disagreement triggers verification rather than conflict. This maintains coherence without suppressing diversity. Fragmentation occurs when shared reference is replaced by abstract coordination. When timing, direction, and decision-making are mediated through opaque systems, individuals lose the ability to verify alignment independently. Collective intelligence collapses into compliance or fragmentation because correction is no longer accessible. Reassembling the blueprint restores collective intelligence by reintroducing common reference points that remain observable and testable. The language of the stars supports this naturally. It scales without ownership, adapts without authority, and corrects through outcome. When societies align around shared external structure, intelligence distributes itself across relationships rather than accumulating in control centers. This creates resilience. Knowledge persists even if individuals fail, because structure remains readable. Collective intelligence is not consensus of belief, but convergence of alignment. It arises when many observers interact with the same reality and allow correction to propagate freely through shared reference rather than imposed interpretation. 90. The skyfilter principle. The skyfilter principle describes how external structure filters perception into usable knowledge. It is the recognition that reality presents more information than cognition can process, and that stable reference systems are required to extract meaningful pattern. The sky functions as the most reliable of these filters because it is consistent, external, and independent of human preference. Filtering is not distortion, it is selection. Without a filter, perception collapses into noise. The sky filters information by constraining attention to repeatable motion, predictable cycles, and measurable change. This allows observers to distinguish signal from randomness without imposing interpretation. Pattern emerges through constraint, not explanation. The skyfilter operates by enforcing comparison across time. A single observation is meaningless in isolation. Repeated observation against the same external reference reveals difference, drift, and threshold. The sky provides continuity that internal memory cannot maintain alone. It anchors perception to something that does not respond to belief, authority, or narrative. Human systems originally extended this filter into architecture, ritual, and geography. These structures preserved sky-based constraints when direct observation weakened. When these extensions degraded, perception lost its filter. Meaning multiplied while accuracy declined. The sky filter principle explains why fragmentation occurred. Without external constraint, internal models drift unchecked. Reassembling the blueprint requires restoring the sky filter consciously. This does not mean abandoning tools or theory, but regrounding them in reference that remains testable. The sky is not symbolic, it is corrective. It reveals error without argument. When cognition is filtered through stable external structure, understanding becomes resilient. The sky filter principle restores alignment by ensuring that perception remains subordinate to reality rather than interpretation. It defines a boundary condition for knowledge. If a model cannot be checked against an indifferent reference, it is incomplete. The sky remains the most comprehensive such reference available, capable of filtering perception into coherent understanding across time, culture, and scale. Part 10. The Living Language. 91. The language of the stars today. The language of the stars has not disappeared, it has been displaced. Its structures remain intact, but modern systems rarely engage them directly. Today, celestial patterns are treated as abstract data streams rather than lived reference, studied through instruments instead of integrated into perception. This shift altered access, not validity. Contemporary science reads the sky with extraordinary precision, yet often isolates findings from human-scale experience. Measurements are accurate, but the relationship between observation and daily orientation has weakened. The sky informs models, but no longer trains attention. As a result, understanding advances technically while pattern literacy atrophies cognitively. Despite this, the language remains readable. Solar cycles still regulate climate. Lunar rhythms still affect tides and biological behavior. Stellar motion still defines long-term reference frames. These patterns continue to operate regardless of engagement. What has changed is the human interface, not the signal. Modern life introduces noise that masks slow structure. Artificial light, mediated time, and enclosed environments compress perception toward immediacy. The sky becomes background rather than guide. Re-engaging its language requires restoring routine observation, not abandoning technology. It requires reinstating reference alongside measurement. The language of the stars today functions as a corrective layer rather than a belief system. It offers external structure that resists distortion. When individuals and societies realign attention to it, internal models stabilize. Understanding becomes grounded again in repeatable pattern rather than narrative accumulation. This is not regression. It is recalibration. The living language persists because it is not encoded in tradition, but written continuously in light, motion, and recurrence. Access depends only on willingness to observe, compare, and correct. 92. Reading reality in real time. Reading reality in real time means maintaining continuous alignment between perception and unfolding structure rather than relying on delayed interpretation. It is the practice of tracking change as it occurs, comparing present signals against established reference, and adjusting understanding immediately when deviation appears. This capacity depends on attention calibrated for process, not outcome. The sky trains this skill naturally. Celestial motion is continuous, not discrete. Positions shift gradually, light changes incrementally, and transitions announce themselves before thresholds are crossed. Observers who attend to rate and direction of change can anticipate transition without waiting for confirmation. This is real-time literacy, grounded in gradient rather than event. Modern systems often invert this process. Data is collected, processed, and interpreted after the fact. While precise, this introduces delay and abstraction. Real-time reading restores immediacy by keeping perception engaged with signal rather than report. The goal is not speed, but responsiveness to trajectory. This practice requires stable reference. Without a fixed frame, change cannot be evaluated. The sky provides that frame because it remains external and indifferent. Reading reality in real time therefore depends on anchoring attention to reference that does not adapt to expectation. Correction occurs when perception yields to structure rather than defending prior models. Real-time reading transforms cognition into an adaptive interface. Decisions become informed by direction and momentum, not static labels. This reduces surprise and increases coherence across action and outcome. The language of the stars supports this mode because it operates continuously, offering feedback without commentary. When observers learn to read change as it unfolds, reality becomes legible moment by moment. Understanding shifts from retrospective explanation to active alignment, allowing individuals and systems to move with structure rather than react after it has already asserted itself. 93. From observer to participant. The shift from observer to participant marks a change in how humans relate to structured reality. Observation alone maintains distance, treating patterns as external phenomena to be watched and interpreted. Participation occurs when behavior is adjusted in response to those patterns, closing the loop between perception and action. This transition transforms knowledge from descriptive to operational. In sky-based systems, participation was unavoidable. Timing agricultural work, travel, construction, or preparation required acting in alignment with observed cycles. The observer who failed to participate correctly experienced immediate consequence. Knowledge was validated through outcome, not explanation. Understanding existed only insofar as it guided action successfully. Participation also deepens perception. When action is synchronized with pattern, sensitivity increases. Small deviations become noticeable because they affect result. This feedback sharpens attention and refines internal models. The participant does not merely see change, they feel its impact through success or failure. This embeds learning more deeply than detached observation. Modern abstraction often interrupts this loop. Observation is separated from consequence, allowing incorrect models to persist without penalty. Participation restores accountability. When action remains tied to external structure, misalignment produces correction. This keeps understanding grounded and adaptive rather than theoretical. Becoming a participant does not mean exerting control over pattern. It means aligning behavior with structure as it unfolds. The sky cannot be altered, but it can be engaged. The language of the stars invites participation by rewarding alignment and exposing error. When humans move from observing patterns to living within them, understanding becomes embodied. Knowledge ceases to be something held and becomes something enacted. This transition completes the learning cycle, integrating perception, decision, and outcome into a unified interface with reality. 94. Self-mastery through pattern literacy. Self-mastery emerges when internal regulation aligns with external structure. It is not achieved through control of impulse alone, but through accurate reading of conditions that shape response. Pattern literacy provides this foundation by training individuals to recognize timing, sequence, and threshold in both environment and behavior. Human systems mirror celestial ones. Energy rises and falls, attention waxes and wanes, and performance follows cycles rather than linear progression. Without pattern awareness, these shifts are experienced as inconsistency or failure. With literacy, they become predictable phases that can be anticipated and managed. Self-mastery begins with recognizing rhythm rather than forcing stability. Celestial observation trained this capacity historically by externalizing reference. The sky demonstrated that decline precedes return and that intensity varies with position and timing. These lessons transferred inward. Individuals learned to pace effort, rest, and decision-making according to cycles rather than expectation. Mastery became alignment, not dominance. Pattern literacy also limits self-deception. When internal states are compared against external reference, misalignment becomes visible. Emotional narratives lose authority when behavior fails to correspond with structure. This enforces honesty without moral framing. Correction follows outcome, not intention. Self-mastery through pattern literacy is therefore practical rather than aspirational. It enables individuals to act at the right time, with appropriate force, and for suitable duration. The language of the stars models this discipline continuously. It shows that effectiveness depends on position within a cycle, not on will alone. When internal behavior is regulated using the same principles that govern external systems, coherence increases. Decisions stabilize, effort becomes efficient, and reaction gives way to anticipation. Self-mastery arises not from imposing control on reality, but from learning to move accurately within its structured flow, allowing behavior to harmonize with pattern rather than resist it. 95. Society aligned with cycles. A society aligned with cycles organizes its structures, timing, and expectations around recurring patterns rather than linear accumulation. Such alignment does not imply stagnation, but coherence. When collective behavior respects rhythm, transition, and threshold, systems operate with less friction and greater resilience. Cyclical alignment begins with time. Work, rest, production, and maintenance follow rhythms that reflect environmental and human capacity. Ignoring these rhythms leads to burnout, scarcity, and instability. Early societies learned this through direct consequence. Modern systems often override cycles, creating short-term output at long-term cost. Infrastructure also reflects alignment. Cities, transportation, and resource systems function best when designed to absorb variation rather than enforce constant throughput. Cycles require slack, pause, and renewal. Systems that lack these features fracture under stress because they cannot accommodate fluctuation. Governance aligned with cycles prioritizes feedback over rigidity. Policies are evaluated through outcome across time, not immediate effect. This allows correction before collapse. Cyclical awareness discourages absolutism because it recognizes that conditions change and that rules must adapt accordingly. Aligning society with cycles does not mean rejecting progress. It means embedding progress within structure that accounts for return, decay, and renewal. The language of the stars provides the model. Celestial systems evolve without abandoning rhythm. When societies mirror this principle, they gain longevity. Alignment reduces crisis frequency by preventing accumulation of unaddressed imbalance. A cyclical society anticipates transition and prepares for it, maintaining coherence by adjusting behavior in advance rather than reacting after failure. 96. Technology and sky awareness. Technology does not inherently disconnect humanity from sky awareness, it replaces reference when design ignores alignment. Tools can either amplify perception or insulate it. The difference lies in whether technology preserves connection to external structure or substitutes outputs for engagement. Sky awareness declines when technology removes the need to observe, compare, and correct. Early tools extended perception. Markers, sightlines, and instruments sharpened attention while preserving verification. Modern technology often inverts this relationship. Systems deliver conclusions without exposing process. Time, location, and condition are provided as readouts rather than derived through engagement. This increases efficiency but weakens pattern literacy. Reintegrating sky awareness into technology requires transparency of reference. Systems should expose underlying cycles rather than mask them. Interfaces that reveal change over time, variation across position, and deviation from baseline restore perceptual grounding. Technology becomes a lens rather than a replacement. Design aligned with sky awareness respects limits. Continuous operation without pause ignores cyclical constraint. Systems that incorporate downtime, recalibration, and seasonal adjustment mirror natural rhythm. This increases longevity and reduces failure. Technology aligned with cycles adapts rather than accumulates stress. Sky awareness and technology are not opposites. They are compatible when tools reinforce external reference instead of replacing it. The language of the stars provides a corrective framework for design, visibility of pattern, tolerance for variation, and enforced feedback. When technology reflects these principles, it enhances human capability without eroding perception. Alignment is restored when tools teach structure rather than obscure it, allowing modern systems to operate within reality rather than above it. 97. Avoiding new dogmas. Avoiding new dogmas is essential when re-engaging with pattern-based understanding. Whenever a system of knowledge becomes fixed, insulated from correction, or defended for identity rather than accuracy, it ceases to function as a tool and becomes an obstacle. The history of lost sky literacy demonstrates that rigidity, not ignorance, is the primary cause of drift. Dogma forms when interpretation replaces reference. Models that were once provisional harden into doctrine when they are no longer tested against external structure. This can occur in scientific, philosophical, or spiritual systems alike. The common failure is the same. Conclusions are preserved while verification is abandoned. Pattern literacy collapses when correction is no longer permitted. The sky itself resists dogma. Celestial behavior does not conform to explanation or expectation. It unfolds according to structure that must be read repeatedly. Any framework that claims final authority without allowing revision is immediately misaligned with this reality. Avoiding dogma therefore requires maintaining continuous exposure to reference rather than retreating into abstraction. New dogmas often arise from partial recovery. When fragments of ancient knowledge are reassembled without restoring verification, they become belief systems rather than operational frameworks. Symbols replace observation, and coherence is asserted instead of demonstrated. This recreates the same conditions that caused fragmentation originally. Avoiding new dogmas demands humility built into method. Understanding must remain conditional, open to revision, and subordinate to outcome. The language of the stars enforces this discipline naturally. It rewards accuracy and exposes error without negotiation. When systems remain anchored to external reference, they resist ossification. Knowledge stays alive because it must continually answer to structure. The safeguard against new dogma is not skepticism alone, but sustained engagement with reality as it is, ensuring that understanding remains a practice rather than a position. 98. The next evolutionary step. The next evolutionary step for humanity is not defined by technological acceleration or expansion of control, but by refinement of alignment. Evolution proceeds when systems increase their capacity to read, respond to, and integrate structured information from their environment. Pattern literacy represents this threshold, where perception and action synchronize with external order rather than override it. Biological evolution favors organisms that anticipate change rather than react after impact. This principle extends to cognition and society. When humans can detect subtle shifts in timing, rate, and direction, adaptation becomes proactive. Crisis is reduced because transition is recognized before thresholds are crossed. This is an evolutionary advantage rooted in perception, not power. Historically, this step has appeared confirmable but unstable. Societies approach alignment, then lose it as abstraction, authority, or convenience replaces reference. The next step differs because modern tools allow alignment to be maintained without abandoning scale or complexity. The challenge is cognitive, not technical. Attention must be retrained to operate across horizons that exceed immediacy. This evolution also redefines intelligence. Intelligence becomes measured by responsiveness to structure rather than accumulation of information. Systems that adjust behavior based on real-time feedback outperform those that defend static models. Flexibility, correction, and humility become adaptive traits rather than philosophical ideals. The next evolutionary step therefore lies in restoring the feedback loop between perception, model, and outcome at every level of organization. Individuals, technologies, and societies must remain open to correction by external reference. The language of the stars provides the template, continuous signal, indifferent to interpretation, unfolding across scales. When humanity aligns cognition and behavior to this structure, evolution shifts from reactive survival to coherent participation. Progress becomes sustainable because it is constrained by reality rather than driven by assertion. This step does not elevate humanity above nature, but reintegrates it more accurately within the systems it has always inhabited. 99. The Golden Age is alignment. The concept of a golden age does not refer to a past utopia or a future state of perfection. It describes a condition of alignment in which human systems operate in sustained correspondence with external structure. When timing, behavior, and organization are synchronized with observable cycles, friction decreases and coherence increases. Prosperity emerges as a consequence of accuracy, not abundance. Historically, periods remembered as golden coincide with stable alignment rather than expansion. Food systems matched seasonal capacity. Social rhythms respected human limits. Knowledge remained verifiable through reference rather than authority. These conditions created resilience, not excess. When alignment held, societies experienced continuity even under constraint. The loss of alignment produces the inverse. Systems push against cycles instead of moving with them. Short-term gain overrides long-term stability. Stress accumulates invisibly until collapse forces correction. This pattern repeats across history because alignment is difficult to maintain when abstraction replaces reference. A golden age therefore cannot be engineered through policy or belief. It emerges when collective behavior remains responsive to feedback across time. This requires distributed pattern literacy, not centralized control. Individuals must be able to detect misalignment locally and adjust without waiting for systemic failure. The language of the stars defines the conditions of alignment clearly. Cycles are honored, thresholds respected, and correction allowed. When societies operate within these constraints, order stabilizes naturally. The golden age is not an endpoint, but a dynamic equilibrium maintained through continuous attention. It persists only as long as alignment is practiced. When reference is abandoned, it fades. When reference is restored, it returns. 100. Humanity is the decoder. Humanity's unique role within the observable system is not to command reality, but to decode it. Unlike other organisms that respond primarily through instinct, humans possess the capacity to recognize abstract pattern, compare across time, and adjust behavior deliberately in response to structure. This makes humanity an interpretive interface between external order and internal action. Decoding requires restraint. The decoder does not impose meaning, it extracts relationship. The sky demonstrates this role clearly. Celestial patterns do not change in response to interpretation, belief, or intention. They remain consistent, indifferent, and testable. Humanity's task has always been to read these patterns accurately and translate them into timing, design, and behavior that remain aligned with reality. This role carries responsibility. When decoding is replaced by projection, systems drift. When interpretation hardens into belief, correction ceases. The failure of past civilizations was not lack of intelligence, but abandonment of the decoder role in favor of authority, narrative, or convenience. Structure was overridden by explanation. When humanity functions as a decoder, intelligence becomes relational rather than extractive. Knowledge is valued for its correspondence, not its novelty. Progress is measured by coherence, not dominance. Action follows timing, and restraint is recognized as a form of accuracy rather than limitation. The language of the stars defines the conditions of decoding precisely. Attention must be sustained, memory must be integrated, correction must be permitted. When these conditions are met, humanity operates as a living interface with structured reality. The decoder does not seek final answers, but continuous alignment. This is the mature position of intelligence within a patterned universe. Not to master the system, but to read it well enough to participate without distortion. When humanity embraces this role fully, understanding stabilizes, adaptation becomes anticipatory, and civilization aligns not through control, but through accurate interpretation of the structure that has always been present.